Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Julius Caesar is one of the most written about human beings who ever lived, and most of what you think you know about him is either incomplete, borrowed from Shakespeare, or both. He was not simply a great general who became a dictator and was stabbed for it. He was a man who grew up watching the Roman Republic kill the people who tried to reform it, who spent 30 years learning exactly how the system worked and exactly where it was already broken. He then used that knowledge with a precision that the system had no answer for, until 23 men with hidden blades decided that knives were a better answer than institutions. But Caesar is only half the story. The other half is the Republic itself, an arrangement of laws and habits and unspoken agreements that had governed Rome for nearly 5 centuries. And that was already coming apart long before Caesar touched it. The question this chronicle turns on is not whether Caesar was a hero or a villain. It is something harder and more interesting than that. Whether a man destroys a system or whether a system, already destroying itself, simply produces the man who finishes the work. That question will not be answered quickly. It will unfold across the life of one of history's most restless minds. From the streets of a city that was outgrowing everything built to contain it, through the courts and the campaigns and the conspiracies, we travel to a January morning in 27 BCE, when a young man sat before the Roman Senate and accepted a name that the world would still be using 2,000 years later. If that sounds like the kind of history worth settling in for, a like and a subscription keeps Quiet Chronicles bringing you a new chronicle every week. The city is waiting. The chronicle begins now. Chapter 1: The City That Made Him. Rome, in the final century of its republic, was a city that had outgrown everything built to contain it. The 7 hills that had once defined its boundaries now sat deep within an urban sprawl of perhaps 1 million people. This was a density of bodies, noise, and competing interest that no ancient city outside Alexandria could match. The Tiber ran brown through it. The insulae, the great apartment blocks that housed the urban poor, rose 4 and 5 stories above streets so narrow that 2 laden carts could not pass each other without one pulling aside. The smell of the city in summer, of tanneries and fulleries, and the accumulated refuse of 1 million daily lives, was something travelers from the provinces noted and never quite forgot. And over all of it, up on the Palatine and the Esquiline and the Caelian hills, sat the houses of the aristocratic families. They believed, with the unexamined confidence of inherited position, that this city and everything it controlled belonged in some essential way to them. The institutions of the Republic had been built for something much smaller: the Senate, the popular assemblies, the annual magistracies. All of it had been designed in the centuries when Rome governed a city-state whose citizens knew each other. In those early days, legions were raised from the property-owning farmers of the surrounding countryside. Political life could be conducted in a single forum by men who met each other daily at the baths and the markets. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. The institutions had not changed. The world they were asked to govern had changed beyond recognition, and the gap between the two was the structural fault that ran beneath everything that followed. Land was the fault's deepest expression. The wars of Roman expansion had concentrated agricultural land in the hands of the aristocratic elite. Great estates were worked by slaves captured in those same wars, while the small farmers who had filled the legions returned to find their holdings gone, sold off during their absence, or swallowed by encroaching latifundia. They drifted to Rome, swelling the urban population. The countryside that had once produced both Rome's grain and Rome's soldiers became a landscape of slave-worked estates producing neither reliably. The Gratian brothers had attempted to address this in the 130s and 120s BCE. Tiberius Gracchus proposed redistributing public land held illegally by aristocratic families beyond the legal limit. The Senate, many of whose members held precisely such land, arranged to have him beaten to death in the Forum with broken chair legs. A decade later, his brother Gaius pursued the same program with broader political support. He died by his own hand as senatorial mobs closed in. The Republic's defenders had demonstrated, before Julius Caesar was born, that they would kill rather than reform. Into this world, Caesar arrived in 100 BCE, a date that, by coincidence or not, was also the year Gaius Marius celebrated his 6th consulship. Marius was then the most powerful man in Rome, a general from the equestrian class who had reformed the Roman army from the ground up. He replaced the old property qualification for service with open enrollment, equipping soldiers at state expense. In doing so, he transferred the loyalty of the legions from the Roman state to the generals who led them. The Marian reform was not designed to produce the civil wars that followed. It produced them anyway. Caesar's family, the gens Julia, was patrician in the oldest sense. Their lineage traced back to the kings and beyond the kings. In the family's own telling, to Iulus, the son of Aeneas, and through Aeneas to Venus herself. Caesar would use this genealogy in public funeral orations throughout his career. With what degree of personal conviction is impossible to say, but with complete political seriousness. Divine descent was a claim that cost nothing and carried weight with the Roman crowd in ways that a list of magistracies did not. The practical reality of the family's position was rather more modest. The gens Julia was old, but not wealthy. They held their place in the Senate's upper tier on the strength of their lineage and their connections, rather than on the strength of their purse. In Rome, where the cursus honorum required a man to finance his own campaigns and spectacles, that distinction mattered considerably. His aunt Julia had married Gaius Marius. This single fact placed the young Caesar at an intersection that would define his political identity for the rest of his life. It was the intersection of the oldest patrician blood and the most consequential popular military politics of the age. When the civil wars of the 80s BCE arrived, Caesar would be associated with the Marian cause whether he chose the association or not. The association carried both its protections and its dangers in equal measure. The civil wars announced themselves with Sulla, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who would eventually award himself the cognomen Felix, meaning the fortunate, had marched his legions on Rome in 88 BCE. It was the first time a Roman general had done such a thing. To reclaim a command the Senate had technically awarded him, and a tribune had technically transferred to Marius. The legal argument was real. The act of marching was a rupture from which the Republic never fully recovered. Marius fled. Sulla governed. Marius returned with his own army the following year, and the first of what would be many political massacres in Rome's streets cleaned the city of Sullan supporters. Then Sulla returned from his eastern campaigns in 83 BCE, and the second massacre, more organized, more thorough, cleaned the city of Marian supporters. The proscriptions of 82 BCE were Sulla's administrative solution to the problem of his enemies. Lists of names were posted in the forum. Any Roman citizen whose name appeared on a list was stripped of legal protection. Anyone could kill him, claim a reward, and purchase his confiscated property at the auction that followed. Sulla's supporters made considerable fortunes in this manner. Marcus Licinius Crassus laid the foundation of his wealth in these auctions, buying the confiscated estates of murdered men at prices that reflected their owners' inability to bid. The proscriptions killed perhaps 1,000 senators and equestrians. They also established a precedent that political violence, systematically organized and legally dressed, was a tool available to whoever held sufficient military force. Caesar was 17 or 18 during the proscriptions, recently married to Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna. Cinna had been Marius's political ally and Sulla's declared enemy. The marriage was a political fact as well as a personal one, and Sulla understood it as such. The dictator, he had taken that title, reviving a constitutional office designed for genuine emergencies, sent word to the young man that he was to divorce Cornelia immediately. The demand was a test as much as an instruction. Compliance would signal one thing. Refusal would signal another. Caesar refused. What followed was a confrontation whose details come to us primarily through Suetonius, writing a century and a half later. Sulla moved to add Caesar to the proscription lists. Caesar, still a teenager, went into hiding in the Sabine hills, moving from place to place as Sulla's agents searched for him. The intercession that saved him came from an unlikely quarter, the College of Vestal Virgins and a group of senior priests. Their religious authority placed them in a category even Sulla was cautious about antagonizing publicly. They appealed on the young man's behalf. Sulla, who had won enough victories to be able to afford occasional mercy, relented. But he relented with a warning, reportedly remarking to those who had interceded that they were welcome to the boy, and that in him they should take care, for there were many Mariuses. The remark is almost certainly polished by the telling. The substance of it, however, corresponds to something real that Sulla seems to have perceived. This particular young man was not simply navigating a dangerous moment. He was something that would require watching. Sulla died in 78 BCE, leaving the Republic to repair itself as best it could, and the proscription lists closed. Caesar emerged from the Sabine hills and returned to a Rome that was, in the technical sense, at peace. The Senate was restored to theoretical supremacy, the emergency powers dissolved, the constitutional forms intact. What was not intact was the understanding that the constitutional forms were precisely forms, that behind them lay the legions, and behind the legions lay whoever the legions trusted. Caesar had grown up entirely inside that understanding. He had never known a Rome where the constitutional settlement could be taken for granted. He had been a child during the first Sullan March, an adolescent during the massacres, a teenager hiding in the hills during the proscriptions. The republic he would spend the next 30 years navigating was not an abstraction to him. It was a specific, known, intimately observed system with specific failure points. And now, with Sulla dead and the city outwardly restored, he descended from the hills into it. He owed Cornelia a life they could now actually live. He carried a warning from a dead dictator and began the long education that the city required. The first lessons would not come cheaply, and they would not come in Rome. Chapter 2: Learning the Game. The lessons Rome required of an ambitious young man in the late Republic were not taught in any single place, and they were not lessons that could be learned quickly. They accumulated through the slow grind of the cursus honorum, through the cultivation of debts owed and debts extended, through the management of public reputation in a city where reputation was the only currency that could not be confiscated. A man who misread the system at 25 might recover. A man who misread it at 40 could not. The ones who had failed to understand this, and the forum's history was littered with them, men of good family and genuine ability who had reached too soon, borrowed too heavily, or antagonized the wrong patron, offered a kind of instructional wreckage. Caesar, who was a careful observer of wreckage, would have found this useful. He left Rome shortly after Sulla's death, which was prudent. The city was still sorting itself out. The Sullan settlement was technically in place, but the networks of obligation and enmity would take years to fully resolve. A young man with obvious Marian connections and a recent history of defying the dictator had good reasons to be elsewhere, while the sorting continued. He went east to the staff of Marcus Minucius Thermus, the Roman governor of Asia. It was in that capacity, as a junior officer on a provincial governor's staff, that he first traveled to the court of Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. This was a small kingdom on the southern coast of the Black Sea. It had maintained its independence through decades of careful diplomatic alignment with Rome. The visit accomplished its stated purpose, which was to secure a fleet for Thermus's military operations. What else it accomplished has been a matter of debate since the moment it happened. Ancient sources, beginning almost immediately, reported that Caesar had entered into a relationship with the elderly king. It was a relationship of a kind that Roman aristocratic culture did not condone. The Romans were not particularly troubled by such arrangements in private, but the specific power dynamic involved placed Caesar in a position of subordination that Roman masculinity found intolerable to contemplate. Caesar denied the reports for the rest of his life, and the reports followed him for the rest of his life. The truth of the matter is now entirely unrecoverable. What is recoverable is that Caesar's enemies never stopped using it, and Caesar's responses to its use were consistently disproportionate in their fury, which tells us something, though not necessarily what his enemies claimed it told. He served well enough under Thermus to be awarded the Corona Civica, the civic crown of oak leaves. This was given to a Roman soldier who had saved the life of a fellow citizen in battle. It was one of the Republic's most prestigious individual military honors. He earned it at the siege of Mytilene in 80 BCE. He was 20 years old. The crown carried with it a permanent right to a front row seat at public games in Rome. It carried the obligation of the crowd to rise when its holder entered. These were not trivial distinctions in a city where public ceremony was also public politics. Caesar wore the crown at every appropriate occasion thereafter. After Sulla's death, he returned to Rome briefly before departing again, this time for Rhodes. There, the rhetorician Apollonius Molon ran what was effectively the Mediterranean world's premier school of public speaking. Cicero had studied there. The crossing was interrupted. Somewhere in the waters between the Italian coast and Rhodes, Caesar's ship was taken by Cilician pirates. Cilician piracy in the late Republic was not a marginal criminal enterprise. It was an organized economic system operating out of the rocky inlets of the southern Anatolian coast. They preyed on Mediterranean shipping with a consistency and reach that Rome had tolerated for decades. The pirates supplied the slave markets that fed the great estates of the Roman aristocracy. They were, in this sense, embedded in the Roman economy even as they disrupted Roman commerce. The Senate's repeated failures to suppress them reflected a genuine conflict of interests among the men who would have had to vote. Caesar's capture was, from the pirates' perspective, routine. From Caesar's perspective, it was an opportunity. He was held for 38 days on a small island, while his companions traveled the Asian coast raising his ransom. The pirates demanded 20 talents of silver, a substantial sum, roughly equivalent to the annual tax revenue of a small provincial town. Caesar told them the figure was an insult. A man of his standing, he informed them, was worth at least 50. The pirates, apparently entertained by this, agreed to the higher ransom. During the 38 days of his captivity, Caesar behaved with a composure that the sources agree on. He slept when he wished, demanded silence when he wanted to rest, and read them his poetry and his speeches. He told them with the tone of a man making a pleasant social observation that he intended to return and crucify every one of them when he was free. The pirates found this funny. They continued to find it funny until Caesar had his ransom paid and borrowed a fleet from the Roman authorities at Miletus. He located their island within 2 weeks and did exactly what he had promised. He crucified them. He had arranged, out of what the sources describe as something like contempt rather than mercy, for their throats to be cut first. He did this so that the crucifixion itself was at least not prolonged. The episode is almost perfectly shaped, too perfectly perhaps, for a story that has passed through a century and a half of telling before it reached Suetonius. But multiple sources confirm its essential outline. What makes it ring true is not the drama of the ending, but the specific detail of the ransom negotiation. The demand that his ransom be raised, that he was worth more than the pirates had thought, is exactly the kind of gesture that reveals character more precisely than any speech could. Caesar did not bargain his captors down to protect his patron's money. He bargained them up to protect his own sense of his value. This is the same man who would, 30 years later, dismiss his personal bodyguard. He did so on the grounds that living under the protection of fear was not worth the inconvenience. He reached Rhodes eventually, studied under Apollonius Molon, and became, by all ancient accounts, an exceptional orator. The Romans considered rhetoric not a decorative accomplishment, but a functional one. It was as essential to a political career as military service. Caesar's training under Apollonius gave him a precision and economy of public speech that his contemporaries noted throughout his career. Cicero, who had studied in the same school and was by general agreement the greatest Roman orator of the age, described Caesar's Latin as the purest and most exact of any man then living. Coming from Cicero, this was not a casual compliment. Back in Rome by 77 BCE, Caesar began the methodical work of establishing himself within the system. He prosecuted Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella, a former governor of Macedonia and a Sullan supporter, for extortion in the provinces. The case was bold for a man of 23. Extortion prosecutions were a recognized route for young aristocrats to build their reputations. They required the kind of sustained, detailed oratorical performance that the forum crowds enjoyed. Caesar lost. Dolabella's connections were deeper than his crimes were visible, and the jury found accordingly. But Caesar had demonstrated something, a precision of attack and a willingness to take on established men. He tried a second extortion prosecution against Gaius Antonius Hybrida, who would later, in one of the Republic's more ironic arrangements, serve as Cicero's co-consul. He achieved the same result, which was losing the case while winning the attention of the crowd. Both prosecutions failed in their immediate purpose and succeeded in their actual one. Caesar was not, at 23, realistically expecting to convict Sullan grandees in Roman courts. He was auditioning for a career in front of the only audience that mattered. The military tribunate came in 73 BCE, elected by popular vote. It was one of the few magistracies decided by the assembly rather than appointed. It was a signal that the crowd's attention had translated into genuine political support. The same year, the slave revolt under Spartacus began in the south. It drew most of Rome's military resources toward Campania and left the city's political life running at a lower temperature than usual. Caesar watched, served his tribunate, and continued building the network of personal obligation that Roman political success required. He lent money he did not have to men who needed it. He attended the funerals of clients too minor for other senators to bother with. He remembered names with a systematic precision. He was elected quaestor in 69 BCE and assigned to the province of Further Spain. This took him away from Rome at a moment of genuine personal weight. Cornelia had died that year. Caesar delivered her funeral oration himself, something that was not customary for a woman of her relatively young age. He wept publicly. Whether the grief was as complete as the performance, no one now can say. But the decision to make the oration public and the decision to display the grief openly were both political choices as well as personal ones. They were made by a man who understood that in Rome, the line between the personal and the political ran through every gesture a public man made. His aunt Julia, Marius's widow, had died the same year. At her funeral, Caesar displayed the imagines, the wax masks of famous ancestors, of Gaius Marius. These had been prohibited under the Sullan settlement. The crowd's response was reportedly split, some applauding, some objecting. Caesar displayed them anyway. The gesture said something precise about where he intended to position himself in the city's political landscape. It said it in the language of public ceremony and public daring. Spain was useful. He governed competently, handled the administrative work of a quaestor's duties, and reportedly stood one day before a statue of Alexander the Great. It was in a temple at Gades, modern Cadiz. He stood there and wept, telling his companions that Alexander had conquered the known world by Caesar's age. He told them he himself had accomplished nothing worth naming. The story is probably apocryphal. It was probably repeated because it captures something the sources wanted to capture about Caesar's ambition: its scale, its impatience, and its tendency toward the theatrical, even in private. Whether or not he wept at Alexander's statue, he left Spain restless. He returned to Rome ahead of schedule without the Senate's formal permission. He began preparing for the next stage of a political career that had spent its first decade doing exactly what it needed to do. He was ready for what came after. The city received him as it received all returning provincial officers, with the polite, watchful attention of a place that had seen many men arrive believing themselves exceptional. It had outlasted most of them. Caesar understood this. He had been watching the city watchmen arrive for 30 years, and he had learned what it took to be one of the ones it did not outlast. What he needed next was money, spectacle, and the kind of alliance that could translate popular attention into institutional power. All three were available if you knew which rooms to walk into and which men to find there. He knew which rooms. He had been studying the map of them since the Sabine Hills. Chapter 3: Crassus, Pompey, and the Man Between Them. Marcus Licinius Crassus had built his fortune on other men's misfortune with a systematic patience that Rome found simultaneously admirable and distasteful. The prescription auctions of Sulla's dictatorship had given him his foundation: confiscated estates sold at prices that reflected the previous owner's inability to complain. And from that foundation he had constructed an economic apparatus of considerable ingenuity. He owned silver mines. He owned several thousand trained slaves, among them architects and builders, whom he deployed through a firefighting operation that functioned less as a public service than as a real estate acquisition mechanism. When a building in Rome caught fire, Crassus's men would arrive promptly, and Crassus would appear shortly after to offer the panicking owner a purchase price that reflected the building's current condition rather than its potential. The owner could accept or watch it burn. Most accepted. Through this and through the systematic cultivation of political debt, loans extended to senators who needed them, called in at moments when the senator's vote or influence was required, Crassus had made himself, by the 70s BCE, not simply the wealthiest man in Rome, but the man through whom a significant portion of Rome's political class moved its money and its obligations. He was indispensable in the way that creditors are indispensable, which is to say completely and without warmth. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was a different kind of power entirely. Where Crassus accumulated quietly, Pompey announced. He had received his cognomen, Magnus the Great, from Sulla himself at the age of roughly 25 after a successful campaign in Africa, and had reportedly greeted the honor with the composed pleasure of a man who had expected it. He had since fought in Sicily, in Africa again, in Spain against the Marian holdout Sertorius, a genuinely formidable general who had maintained an independent Roman state in the Iberian Peninsula for nearly a decade, and had returned from each campaign with the reliable product of successful Roman warfare, which was glory, plunder, and the loyalty of thousands of veterans whose futures were now professionally intertwined with his own. His relationship with the Senate was the relationship of a man who needed its formal approval for everything and its actual cooperation for nothing, and both parties understood this with the clarity that comes from long acquaintance. The slave revolt of Spartacus had given each man a moment. Crassus had accepted the command when no senator of higher standing would. The revolt had been running for 2 years, had defeated several Roman armies, and had acquired the particular political toxicity of a problem that kept getting worse, and had conducted the suppression with methodical brutality, eventually cornering Spartacus's army in the toe of Italy and breaking it in a final engagement in 71 BCE. Pompey, returning from Spain with his army at precisely that moment, had encountered several thousand escaped slaves fleeing northward from Crassus's battle and had destroyed them, and then written to the Senate that while Crassus had won the battle, he himself had pulled up the war by the roots. Crassus received this communication in the way a man receives a calculated insult from someone he cannot yet afford to destroy. The two men celebrated a joint triumph and were elected consuls together for 70 BCE, a pairing so mutually uncomfortable that ancient sources agree it produced almost no actual governing, but a great deal of visible tension. Into the rooms of these two men Caesar now walked, carrying the map he had been studying since his return from Spain. He was 30 years old, recently elected aedile for 65 BCE, and he needed money with a specificity and urgency that made the cultivation of Crassus not merely useful, but structurally necessary. The aedileship was one of the magistracies whose political value was directly proportional to the scale of the public spectacles its holder could produce: games, festivals, the maintenance and decoration of public buildings, and Caesar had decided, with the deliberateness that marked all his major decisions, that his aedileship would be remembered. He staged gladiatorial games on a scale that strained every creditor relationship he had. 320 pairs of gladiators appeared in the arena, all of them equipped in silver armor, a detail that served no military purpose, and every theatrical one. He decorated the Forum and the Capitoline with such extravagance that the Senate, alarmed at what a man of Caesar's evident ambition might do if he controlled public space indefinitely, passed a law limiting the number of gladiators any individual could display. The law was aimed at Caesar specifically and transparently enough that no one pretended otherwise. The games did what he had designed them to do. The Roman crowd responded to spectacle with the loyalty of people who recognized a patron performing his obligations at exceptional scale, and Caesar's name settled into the popular memory of the city in a way that no amount of competent administration could have achieved. Crassus, whose money had underwritten a significant portion of the spectacle, and who was not a man given to financing other people's ambitions without calculating the return, watched the crowd's response and concluded that his investment was sound. The election for Pontifex Maximus came in 63 BCE. The position, chief priest of Rome, head of the state religious apparatus, occupant of the official residence on the Via Sacra, was not primarily a religious office in the modern sense. It was a political one, carrying with it the authority to interpret the state's religious obligations, to control the calendar of permitted activities, and to occupy a house in the forum's immediate vicinity at public expense, which in a city where proximity to the center of power was itself a form of power, mattered considerably. The incumbent was an elderly man named Metellus Pius, who died in office, opening the position to an election among the senators and equestrians who voted in such matters. Caesar stood. His opponents were two men of considerably greater seniority and establishment, Quintus Lutatius Catulus and Publius Servilius Vitia Esoricus, both former consuls, both credentialed with the kind of accumulated magistracies that normally determined these contests before the voting began. Caesar's campaign, financed by Crassus's network, was conducted with the systematic attention to individual obligation that he had been building for years. On the morning of the vote, as he was leaving the house, his mother Aurelia accompanied him to the door. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable intelligence and political awareness who had supervised his education with a directness unusual for the period. Caesar reportedly told her, as she walked him out, that he would return as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all. The margin of his victory, when the votes were counted, was substantial enough to surprise even his supporters. He moved into the official residence on the Via Sacra. Aurelia moved with him, which meant that Caesar, now Pontifex Maximus, occupant of a public house, surrounded by the religious apparatus of the Roman state, had arranged his domestic situation with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. The Catilinarian conspiracy of 63 BCE arrived that same year, and with it the crisis that revealed most clearly where the Senate's fault lines actually ran. Lucius Sergius Catiline, was a patrician of the old blood and diminished fortune who had spent the previous several years attempting to win the consulship through legitimate means and failing, accumulating as he failed a following of the desperate and the indebted that eventually tilted from political movement into something closer to armed conspiracy. The details of what Catiline actually planned vary depending on which ancient source is trusted, but Cicero, who had been elected consul that same year and who discovered or constructed the evidence against him, depending again on which source is trusted, treated the conspiracy as an existential threat to the Republic and responded accordingly. He delivered 4 Catilinarian speeches in the Senate and before the people, speeches so precisely constructed and so thoroughly rehearsed that they were circulating in written form almost before the echo had left the forum's stones. The Senate convened to decide the conspirators' fate. Cicero wanted execution. The question was whether the Senate had the authority to execute Roman citizens without trial, a constitutional question that was also a deeply practical one, since the precedent would matter long after Catiline was dead. Caesar rose and argued for imprisonment. His speech, as reconstructed by Sallust, was careful and legally exact. He acknowledged the severity of the conspiracy, accepted that the conspirators were enemies of the state, and then argued that execution without trial was a precedent the Senate should refuse to set, not because the men deserved mercy, but because the Senate should not hand future demagogues a tool they would certainly use. The argument was correct. It was also in the room where Cato the Younger sat preparing his response, politically suicidal. Cato rose and delivered a speech of such concentrated moral force that the Senate moved almost immediately to reverse the weight of opinion. He accused Caesar of sympathy with the conspirators, implied with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was implying that Caesar's moderation concealed complicity and drove the Senate to a vote for execution. The conspirators were strangled in the Tullianum that same evening. Caesar left the Senate under an escort of equestrians who had drawn their swords, whether to protect him or threaten him, being a matter the sources debate without resolution. Cato and Caesar had now met in the Senate's full assembly, and what had met was not merely two political positions, but two temperaments that were genuinely, structurally incompatible. Cato was a Stoic in the full philosophical sense, a man who believed that virtue was the only good, that the Republic's institutions embodied an approximation of virtue worth dying for, and that compromise with men like Caesar was not a political calculation, but a moral failure. Caesar was something harder to categorize, not cynical, not unprincipled, but operating from a set of principles that placed effectiveness and his own position at their center in ways that Cato's framework simply had no room for. They would spend the remaining 20 years of Caesar's life in a state of mutual recognition that was almost, in its clarity, a form of respect. The praetorship of 62 BCE and the subsequent governorship of further Spain gave Caesar his first extended military command of substance. He governed the province competently, conducted a campaign against local tribes in the northwest of the peninsula, with enough success to be saluted imperator by his troops, the acclamation that entitled a commander to petition the Senate for a triumph, and return to Rome with money he had mostly extracted from the province, debts he had partially repaid, and a clearer sense of what a military command felt like from the inside. The governorship had done what governorships were supposed to do for an ambitious man in the late Republic. It had given him soldiers, revenue, a title, and a legitimate reason to have been away from Rome while certain obligations were deferred. He came back to the city in 60 BCE and found it in roughly the configuration he had left it, with the notable addition that Pompey returned from his extraordinary eastern campaigns, having reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean from the Caucasus to Palestine, and multiplied Rome's annual revenues by something close to 70% in the process, was discovering that the Senate had no intention of ratifying his eastern settlements or distributing land to his veterans. The Senate's refusal was technically defensible and practically catastrophic. Pompey had delivered Rome the most successful military expansion in a generation, and the Senate was declining to honor the commitments that the campaigns had implicitly required. Crassus, who had his own grievances with the Senate over tax contracts in Asia, was equally obstructed. Two of the most powerful men in Rome were sitting outside the system's normal channels of resolution, with resources and frustrations that were looking for somewhere to go. Caesar understood what he was looking at. He had known which rooms to walk into since the Sabine Hills, and now he walked into both of them and began explaining to each man what the three of them could accomplish together that none of them could accomplish alone. The consulship of 59 BCE was 12 months away. He intended to win it, and he intended to use it, and the alliance he was assembling in those rooms would make both intentions possible in ways that the Senate, still congratulating itself on its management of the Catilinarian crisis, had not yet begun to calculate. Chapter 4: The Consulship. 59 BCE opened with Caesar in the consulship and the Senate already bracing for what that meant. The election had gone as the alliance had designed it. Caesar's popular support, Pompey's military prestige, and Crassus's financial network had combined into something the optimates could not outspend or outmaneuver at the voting assemblies, though they had tried both. His co-consul was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, Cato's son-in-law, a man of genuine administrative competence and implacable optimate conviction who had run against Caesar in the aedileship election years earlier and lost, and who arrived at the consulship of 59 BCE with a clear understanding of what his role was intended to be, which was to obstruct, delay, and if possible render inert everything Caesar intended to do. The Senate's strategy, such as it was, rested on Bibulus. It was not a strong foundation. Caesar moved immediately. The land bill was his first instrument, a proposal to distribute the Ager Campanus, the fertile public land in Campania that had been accumulating in aristocratic holdings since the Gracchian era, among Pompey's veterans and the urban poor who qualified under the bill's census provisions. The bill was carefully constructed to be difficult to oppose on its merits. It touched only public land, not private holdings. It compensated current users at fair market value. It addressed in a direct and practical way both the veteran land crisis that had been destabilizing Roman politics since the Marian reforms and the urban poverty that fed the city's permanent population of the displaced. Cicero, who opposed it, later admitted in private correspondence that he could find no good argument against its substance, only against the man proposing it. Caesar brought the bill to the Senate. The Senate debated. Cato spoke against it, not on its merits, which he acknowledged were defensible, but on procedural grounds, on the grounds of precedent, on the grounds that the speed of the proposal indicated that something larger was being obscured behind its reasonable surface. He spoke for so long and with such determined continuity that Caesar, who was presiding, had him arrested and led from the chamber. This produced the remarkable spectacle of senators rising to follow Cato to prison in solidarity, which then produced the equally remarkable spectacle of Caesar releasing Cato rather than allow the arrest to become a martyrdom narrative, which then produced Cato returning immediately to the Senate floor and resuming his speech. Caesar abandoned the session. He took the bill to the popular assembly instead, bypassing the Senate entirely, which was legally permissible and constitutionally aggressive in roughly equal measure. Bibulus attempted to halt the proceedings by invoking obnuntiatio, the ancient procedure by which a magistrate could suspend public business by announcing that he was watching the sky for unfavorable omens, a religious veto that required no evidence and admitted no argument. Caesar ignored the announcement. This was not technically legal. It was also not something anyone in the forum that morning was prepared to physically prevent. Bibulus was surrounded by a crowd whose mood had been carefully prepared by weeks of Caesar's cultivation, and the crowd's preparation expressed itself when someone, the sources disagree on exactly who, emptied a basket of dung over the co-consul's head. Bibulus retreated from the forum with as much dignity as the circumstances permitted, which was not much. He went home and did not return to public life for the remaining 10 months of his consulship. From his house he issued a continuous stream of edicts announcing unfavorable omens for every day of the year, a procedural declaration that, if taken seriously, would have invalidated every piece of legislation Caesar passed. Nobody took it seriously. Romans, who had a well-developed appreciation for political absurdity, began referring to the year not as the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, the standard formula using both consuls' names, but as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. The joke required no explanation and offered no comfort to the optimates, who found themselves in the position of being both outmaneuvered and mocked simultaneously. The land bill passed. Within weeks, Pompey's veterans were being registered for allotments on the Campanian plain, and the Senate's long resistance to honoring his eastern settlements dissolved into irrelevance as the practical fact of distribution made the political argument moot. Pompey's gratitude was real and immediate, and Caesar moved to make it structural. His daughter Julia, she was perhaps 14, perhaps a few years older, the sources are imprecise, was engaged to a young man named Servilius Caepio. The engagement was dissolved without, apparently, Servilius Caepio's prior knowledge or Julia's either, and Julia was married to Pompey instead. Pompey was in his mid-40s, a widower with children older than his new wife, and the marriage was arranged entirely as a political instrument. What makes it notable in retrospect is that it became something more than that. Ancient sources who have no particular reason to sentimentalize the arrangement report that Julia and Pompey were genuinely attached to each other, that Pompey's behavior during their marriage showed an affection that surprised people who knew him primarily as a military and political figure, and that when Julia died in 54 BCE, the bond between Caesar and Pompey died with her in ways that the political structure could not replace. But that was 5 years away. In 59 BCE, the marriage was fresh and the alliance was working, and Caesar turned to the remaining items on his legislative agenda with the compressed efficiency of a man who understood that a consulship lasted 12 months and that everything not accomplished in those 12 months would need to be fought for again. Crassus's grievances with the Senate over the Asian tax contracts were resolved. Caesar pushed through a revision of the contracts that reduced the publicani's obligations to the state, a measure that would have been fiscally controversial regardless of its merits, but that passed because the three men's combined weight in the assemblies made passing it straightforward. Ptolemy XII of Egypt, whose claim to the Egyptian throne was disputed and who needed Roman recognition to stabilize it, paid an enormous sum, ancient sources say 6,000 talents, into the appropriate Roman accounts and received his recognition. Clodius Pulcher, the patrician tribune-elect whose usefulness to Caesar required him to be technically plebeian in order to stand for the tribunate, was formally adopted into a plebeian family in a ceremony that the Senate watched with undisguised awareness of what it meant. Clodius was Caesar's instrument for Rome's street-level politics, a man with genuine popular support in the urban neighborhoods and a talent for organized crowd activity that Caesar intended to deploy from the tribunate once he himself had left for Gaul. The Gallic command was the final and most consequential piece. Through the tribune Vatinius, another instrument, more blunt than Clodius but serviceable, Caesar secured passage of a law granting him the province of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum for 5 years, with 3 legions. The Senate then added Transalpine Gaul, the Roman province in southern France, when its governor died unexpectedly, which brought the total command to something unprecedented in its combination of duration, geographic scope, and military force. 5 years of imperium, legal protection from prosecution while in command, 5 years of legions at his disposal, 5 years of distance from a senate that would otherwise have him in court before the year was out, dismantling the alliances and prosecuting the illegalities of the consulship the moment his immunity expired. The Gallic command was not primarily a military adventure. It was a legal sanctuary that happened to come with legions. He left Rome in the spring of 58 BCE, but not before one final arrangement. His new wife was Calpurnia, daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was elected consul for 58 BCE, conveniently ensuring that the year after Caesar's departure would be managed by a family connection rather than an enemy. Caesar's domestic arrangements had always been, in this sense, continuous with his political ones. He had married Cornelia because she was Cinna's daughter. He had not divorced her when Sulla demanded it. He had mourned her publicly when she died. He had married Pompeia next, a granddaughter of Sulla, which balanced his Marian associations with a Sullan connection at a moment when the balance was useful, and had divorced her in 61 BCE after the Bonadea scandal, when Clodius had been found disguised as a woman at the women's-only religious festival held in Caesar's house, which was a scandal both religious and political. When asked at Clodius's subsequent trial why he had divorced his wife if he believed her innocent, Caesar gave the answer that has followed him through the centuries. His wife must be above suspicion. The line was polished. So was everything else. Calpurnia was 19 and the daughter of a useful man. The marriage would last until the Ides of March, and she would be of the 3 women Caesar married, the one about whose feelings for him the ancient sources are most specific. It was Calpurnia who dreamed the night before the assassination that the pediment of their house collapsed. Calpurnia who begged him not to go to the Senate. Calpurnia whose warning he dismissed with the composed certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life making calculated bets on his own indispensability. The wagons loaded. The legions assembled north of the city, where Roman law required them to wait. Caesar crossed the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, which a general with imperium could not cross without surrendering his command, and did not re-enter Rome as a private citizen for 9 years. Behind him he left a senate that was furious, an alliance that was holding, a city that was politically reorganized in ways it was still absorbing, and the instruments he had placed in the tribunate and the consulship to manage things in his absence. Ahead of him lay a province, and beyond the province, a world that had not yet learned what he could do with legions and time, and the willingness to spend both without restraint. The mountains waited at the edge of the Italian plain. Beyond them, Gaul. Chapter 5. Gaul. Gaul in 58 BCE was not a single thing. It was a landscape of considerable geographic variety. The broad river valleys of the Seine and the Loire, the dense forests of the Ardennes, the flat coastal marshes of the north, the granite uplands of the Massif Central, and an equally varied human geography of tribal confederacies, shifting alliances, long-running feuds, and the kind of internal political complexity that Caesar's commentary acknowledge when acknowledging it serves his narrative, and quietly omit when it does not. The Romans had governed a southern strip of the territory, Transalpine Gaul, the Provincia, which gave its name eventually to the entire region of Provence, for several generations, and had a working familiarity with the tribes immediately bordering their roads and markets. What lay north and west of that strip was known in outline and unknown in detail, which in Roman strategic thinking translated fairly directly into an argument for finding out. The Helvetia provided the opening. They were a confederation of tribes occupying the plateau of what is now Switzerland, hemmed in by mountains, the Rhine, and the growing pressure of Germanic peoples moving westward from across the river. In the spring of 58 BCE, they began a planned migration westward, a movement of perhaps 250,000 people by Caesar's own figures, which modern scholars treat with appropriate skepticism, intending to resettle in the more spacious territory of western Gaul. Their route took them through the Roman Provincia. Caesar refused permission. They attempted a crossing of the Rhone in his absence and were turned back by the fortifications his engineers had built in the 2 weeks since their first request. They found another route through the territory of the Aedui, a tribe formerly allied with Rome. Caesar followed, caught the Helvetia column stretched across the plain near Bibracte, and broke it in a battle that lasted the better part of a day and ended with the survivors, perhaps a third of those who had set out, turning back to resettle the plateau they had abandoned. He sent them home and recorded the victory. It was the first engagement, and it established a pattern that the next 7 years would repeat in varying configurations. A Gallic movement or threat provides the occasion. Caesar responds with a speed that consistently surprises his opponents. The battle is won through a combination of legionary discipline and Caesar's personal willingness to appear at the point of maximum danger when discipline alone is insufficient, and the written account of the engagement is dispatched to Rome before the bodies are fully cold. The Commentari de Bello Gallico, the war commentaries, were composed and released in annual installments throughout the campaigns, written in the third person throughout, Caesar referring to himself as Caesar with a consistency that creates, after several books, an almost hypnotic detachment. Caesar, seeing that the enemy held the high ground, ordered the Fourth Legion to advance. The prose is as clear and compressed as anything written in Latin, Cicero's judgment, not just a general assessment, and it is also, without ever quite lying, a sustained piece of political advocacy for the man it nominally describes in the third person. The dispatches kept Caesar's name in Roman political conversation throughout 8 years of absence. They were the consulship's communications strategy, extended into the province. The Germanic king Ariovistus came next. He had crossed the Rhine years earlier at the invitation of a Gallic tribe seeking military assistance, and had since established himself in Alsace, with a following of Germanic warriors who showed no inclination to return home. Other Gallic tribes had appealed to Rome for assistance against him. Caesar met Ariovistus in negotiation first. The meeting was tense, conducted on horseback on a raised mound in the open plain, with cavalry drawn up on both sides, and found him contemptuous of Roman authority and confident in his military position. The battle that followed, fought somewhere on the Alsatian plain in late summer 58 BCE, was decided in part by Caesar's tactical reading of the moment, and in part by the Germanic warriors' specific weakness, which was anxiety about the welfare of their families watching from the wagons drawn up behind the battle line. Caesar's cavalry, ordered to attack the wagon line rather than the warriors, produced a panic that spread forward into the fighting. Ariovistus escaped across the Rhine. His kingdom in Gaul did not survive the crossing. 2 campaigns in 1 year. Caesar wintered his legions in Gaul rather than returning them to the Provincia, a decision that was legally questionable and strategically essential, since wintering in Gaul signaled to every tribe in the territory that Rome's interest in the region was not temporary and transactional, but permanent and structural. The distinction was understood. The following spring, the Belgic tribes of the north, a loose confederation of peoples occupying modern Belgium and the northern Netherlands, described by Caesar as the fiercest of all the Gauls, a judgment that the subsequent campaigns would largely confirm, united against the Roman presence and marched south. The campaign against the Belgae in 57 BCE produced the Battle of the Sabis River against the Nervii that came closest to destroying Caesar's army outright. The Nervi had prepared their ambush with a sophistication that Caesar's account typically acknowledges while arranging to reflect well on him regardless. They had cut down the trees along the river bank in interlocking patterns that blocked the Roman cavalry's sight lines and concealed the waiting warriors. When 2 of Caesar's legions reached the river and began making camp, the other legions still strung out on the march behind them, the Nervii attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. The 2 forward legions were broken into isolated groups fighting independently, the camp half built, the cavalry scattered. Caesar moved through the chaos personally, taking a shield from a soldier in the rear ranks and pushing forward to the front, which his sources present as inspiration and which also reflects something genuinely characteristic about how he commanded. He was not a general who directed battles from elevated ground at safe remove. The other legions arrived in time. The Nervi were broken so thoroughly that their senate, when it surrendered, reported that of 600 senators, 3 had survived, and of 60,000 warriors, perhaps 500. The expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE were logistically ambitious and territorially inconclusive in ways that Caesar's commentary handle with the careful prose of a man aware that his audience expected more than he had delivered. Britain was known to the Roman world primarily as a source of tin, pearls, and slaves, and as the place from which Gallic tribes received reinforcements and refuge during the continental campaigns. Caesar crossed in late summer 55 BCE with 2 legions, fought several engagements along the Kentish coast, accepted the nominal submission of several tribal leaders, and returned to Gaul before the season closed. The following year he crossed again with 5 legions and cavalry, penetrated further inland, crossed the Thames, accepted the submission of the powerful king Cassivellaunus, and returned again. Neither expedition produced a permanent Roman presence. Both produced dispatches that Rome received as great victories, and the Senate decreed 20 days of public thanksgiving, longer than for any previous triumph. The gap between the Thanksgiving's duration and the expedition's practical results was not, in Rome, discussed openly. The Gallic revolt that began in 52 BCE was different in kind from everything that had preceded it. It was organized rather than reactive, coordinated across tribal boundaries that had previously prevented sustained cooperation, and led by a figure of genuine political intelligence, Vercingetorix, a young chieftain of the Arverni whose father had been killed by his own people for aspiring to kingship, and who had apparently concluded from his father's fate that the aspiration required better timing and broader support than his father had managed to assemble. He built his coalition through a combination of personal charisma, strategic clarity, and the ruthless suppression of pro-Roman factions within the tribes he consolidated, burning the settlements of tribes that wavered, executing leaders who negotiated. His strategy was essentially correct. Avoid pitched battle with the legions, destroy food supplies, strike Roman lines of communication and supply. Let the Gallic winter do the work that Gallic warriors could not. He came close to making it work. Caesar's response to the revolt required him to cross the Alps in winter, an act his army considered impossible, and that he conducted with the compressed urgency of a man who understood that every week of delay was a week Vercingetorix spent consolidating. He moved through the Cevens in deep snow, reached his legions, and began a series of operations that culminated at the hill town of Alesia in September 52 BCE. Alesia sat on a plateau above two rivers, its approaches dominated by the heights on which Vercingetorix had concentrated the Gallic forces after an engagement outside Dijon had gone badly enough to make the open plain untenable. Caesar looked at the plateau and ordered his engineers to build a siege works around it. What they built was an engineering achievement that ancient sources describe with the admiration of people who understood construction. The inner line of circumvallation, the wall facing Alesia to keep the garrison in, ran roughly 11 miles. The outer line, the wall facing outward, to hold off the relief army that Vercingetorix had summoned before the siege closed, ran roughly 14 miles. Between the two walls, Caesar's army of perhaps 50,000 men waited, besieging an army of perhaps 80,000 inside Alesia, while a relief force of perhaps 250,000, Caesar's figures, treated by historians as substantial exaggerations, but the reality was very large regardless, gathered outside their backs. The Romans dug. The Gauls watched from the walls. The relief army arrived and attacked the outer wall. Vercingetorix attacked the inner wall simultaneously. Caesar moved along the walls in person during the final assault, his red cloak visible to both sides as a signal of where the pressure was greatest and where he was going. The relief army broke. Vercingetorix, the following morning, assembled his chieftains and told them they had two choices: kill him and send his head to Caesar, or deliver him alive. They chose delivery. He rode out of the gates of Alesia on his finest horse, fully armed, circled Caesar's tribunal once, dismounted, removed his armor, and sat at Caesar's feet in silence. Caesar had him bound and sent to Rome, where he would wait in the Tullianum for 6 years until he was displayed in Caesar's triumph and executed. The human cost of the Gallic Wars is recorded in the ancient sources, with the detachment appropriate to figures of that scale. Caesar himself reports, without evident discomfort, that 1 million Gauls died in the campaigns, and another 1 million were enslaved. Modern scholarship treats these numbers as substantial overestimates produced by a commander with political reasons to maximize his achievements. But even at a fraction of those figures, the demographic consequence for Gaul was generational. Entire tribal confederacies ceased to exist as political entities. Territories that had been densely populated were emptied. The landscape Caesar's legions crossed in 58 BCE and the landscape they left in 50 BCE were not the same landscape, and the difference was not a natural one. This is the fact that the Commentaria's clear prose, its third-person composure, its careful accounting of battles and submissions and the restoration of order, does not quite obscure, though it does not quite state it either. Caesar returned from the campaigns the wealthiest private individual in the Roman world, the commander of 8 legions whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional, and the author of a prose account of his own decade that schoolboys would be reading as a Latin primer for the next 4 centuries. He had also, in the years since leaving Rome, watched the political architecture he had built with such care begin to come apart in ways that the distance of Gaul made it difficult to manage and impossible to ignore. The news from Rome grew worse with each courier. The alliance was fraying. The men he had left in place were losing ground, and somewhere south of the Alps, in the city he had not entered as a private citizen in 9 years, the Senate was assembling the legal instruments it needed to strip him of everything the campaigns had built. The mountains were behind him now, and the arguments waited on the other side. Chapter 6: Crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon was not an impressive river. It ran perhaps 30 miles through the flat agricultural land of the Romagna, shallow enough in most seasons to wade, unremarkable in every physical respect except one. It marked the legal boundary between the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. A Roman general holding imperium, the legal authority to command armies, was required by constitutional law to leave that authority behind when he crossed the boundary. His troops stayed north. He crossed as a private citizen, unprotected by the immunity his command provided, available to the courts and the prosecutors and the political enemies who had been accumulating grievances against him for 9 years and who had been very specific in the Senate debates of the previous months about what they intended to do with him the moment that immunity expired. The Rubicon was a thin line of water with enormous legal weight, and everyone in Rome understood exactly what it meant. The architecture of what brought Caesar to its bank had been assembling itself piece by piece since Julia died in 54 BCE. She had been in labor with a child that did not survive, and she did not survive either. She was perhaps 22, perhaps a few years older, and Pompey's grief at her death was reported by sources who had every reason to be skeptical of the man's emotional life and were not skeptical of this. The Roman crowd, which had loved her, carried her body to the Campus Martius for burial against the Senate's wishes, which was an act of popular sentiment rather than political calculation and moved Pompey visibly. But sentiment does not replace structure, and what Julia's death removed from the alliance between Caesar and Pompey was the one bond that had operated outside the logic of mutual interest. Everything that remained between them was political, and political bonds in the late Republic had a specific half-life that both men understood. Crassus died the following year. He had spent years maneuvering for a military command that would give him the military glory that Pompey had always possessed, and he had always lacked. His suppression of Spartacus had been thorough but not glamorous, a domestic pacification rather than an eastern conquest, and the Senate's memory of it reflected accordingly. The Parthian command, secured in 55 BCE, sent him east with 7 legions and the intention of conquering the Mesopotamian heartland. In June of 53 BCE, near the town of Carrhae in what is now southeastern Turkey, his army encountered the Parthian cavalry force under the general Sharina and discovered, over the course of a catastrophic afternoon, that the tactical assumptions underpinning Roman infantry warfare did not translate well to a flat desert plain against an opponent who had no intention of closing to hand range. The Parthian horse archers circled the Roman formation continuously, shooting, withdrawing, shooting again, what later military historians would call the Parthian shot, and the legions, trained to close and engage, could neither reach them nor endure them. 20,000 Romans died at Carrhae. 10,000 more were captured and marched east to serve as slave labor in the Parthian frontier provinces. Crassus himself was killed during a parley, the circumstances disputed, the death unambiguous. Ancient sources added the detail that the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth afterward, a reference to his legendary wealth that is probably invented and perfectly captures what the ancient world thought of him regardless. The news reached Caesar in Gaul with the implications fully legible. The three-legged structure that had supported his political position in Rome, his own popular following, Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's financial and senatorial network, had lost one of its legs entirely. What remained was a two-man arrangement between Caesar and Pompey, and two-man arrangements in Roman politics had a specific tendency to resolve into one-man arrangements given sufficient time and pressure. The pressure came from several directions simultaneously. Clodius Pulcher, Caesar's instrument in the tribunate, the man who had driven Cicero into exile in 58 BCE and managed the city's street-level politics with a talent for organized violence that Caesar had found useful from a distance, was murdered on the Appian Way in January 52 BCE. His killer was Titus Annius Milo, a rival gang organizer with senatorial backing, who encountered Clodius's party by apparent accident on the road south of Rome and turned the encounter into something that was not accidental in its outcome. The death of Clodius produced a genuine popular eruption. His body was carried to the Forum, displayed on the rostra, and eventually cremated inside the Senate house itself, which burned in the process, the flames visible across the city. The disorder was real and sustained enough that the Senate took the extraordinary step of appointing Pompey as sole consul for 52 BCE, the first such appointment in Roman history outside the formal dictatorship, a constitutional novelty that required the Senate to either not notice or not care about the precedent it set. Pompey accepted the appointment with appropriate expressions of reluctance and set about restoring order with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for the city to need him in exactly this way. His alignment with the Senate optimates was now visible and structural rather than merely tactical. The men who had spent a decade obstructing Pompey's eastern settlements and his veterans' land distributions were now his political partners, united by the shared interest that Caesar's continued power represented to all of them. Cato, who had opposed Pompey for years with the same principled consistency he brought to everything, made the calculation that Pompey inside the constitutional structure was preferable to Caesar outside it, and adjusted accordingly. It was not a comfortable adjustment for either man, but the late republic ran on uncomfortable adjustments made by principled men who had run out of better options. The Lucca Conference of 56 BCE had been the triumvirate's last successful coordination. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus meeting in the northern Italian town to extend all three men's commands for 5 years and distribute the political landscape among themselves with the candor of men who no longer felt the need to pretend the distribution was happening through constitutional channels. Caesar's Gallic command was extended. Pompey received Spain. Crassus received Syria and the Parthian adventure that would kill him. The conference had held the structure together for 3 more years. With Crassus dead and Pompey repositioned, it was now a memory of a different arrangement, invoked occasionally in Senate debates to establish precedents that no longer applied. The Senate's ultimatum arrived in stages rather than as a single declaration, each stage a tightening of the legal vice. Caesar was required to surrender his command by a specific date or be declared a public enemy. His request to stand for the consulship in absentia, to remain under his command's legal protection while his candidacy was processed, a precedent that existed in Roman law and that Pompey had himself used, was first permitted and then revoked as Pompey's influence with the Senate solidified. The compromise proposals that Caesar sent, he would surrender his command if Pompey surrendered his simultaneously. He would give up his provinces if he were guaranteed the consulship immediately, were rejected, sometimes without full Senate debate, as the Optimate's confidence in Pompey's military backing made compromise feel unnecessary. Mark Antony and another tribune named Quintus Cassius, who had vetoed the senatorial decrees on Caesar's behalf, were physically threatened in the Senate House and fled Rome dressed as slaves, joining Caesar north of the Rubicon and providing him with the additional political argument that the tribune's sacred legal immunity had been violated, which meant the Senate had already broken the constitutional order it claimed to be defending. Caesar addressed his soldiers at Ravenna. The speech, as Plutarch and Appian reconstruct it, was not long, and its central argument was straightforward: that the Senate had violated the law, that the tribunes had been driven from the city, that the soldiers had served faithfully for 9 years and were owed the protection of a commander willing to act on their behalf. The 13th Legion, which had been with him since Gaul, responded in the way that Marian Reformed legions responded to generals who had led them through 8 years of successful campaigning, which was with the commitment that comes from shared experience and shared stakes. Caesar had never been primarily a distant commander. He had taken the shield from the soldier at the Sabis River and walked to the front, and the 13th Legion remembered things like that. He moved at night, January 10th, turning into the 11th, 49 BCE. The ancient sources collect around the river bank several stories that may be authentic, may be later embellishment, and may be both simultaneously, that he hesitated, that he quoted Menander's line about the die being cast, that he saw a vision or heard a sound that resolved the hesitation. What the sources agree on is the act itself, which requires no embellishment. A Roman general crossed the Rubicon with a combat-ready legion, knowing exactly what the crossing meant under Roman law, knowing that he was making war on the constitutional order he had spent his career operating within, and knowing that there was no version of what came next that ended with everything returned to how it had been. The river was narrow. The crossing did not take long. On the other side, Italy stretched southward in the winter dark, and somewhere down the road that ran along the Adriatic coast, Rome waited, the city that had made him, the city whose every room and alliance and fault line he had studied for 30 years, the city he had left 9 years ago with legions waiting north of the mountains and instruments placed in the tribunate to manage things in his absence. Those instruments were gone now. The management had ended. What remained was the man and the legion and the road and whatever waited at the other end of it. Pompey was in Rome. The Senate was in session, and neither of them, when the news arrived, was entirely certain what to do. Chapter 7: The Civil War. What the crossing set in motion was not, at first, the war that either side had imagined. The Senate's plan had depended on Pompey's legions being available in Italy, ready to meet Caesar at the border and end the matter quickly. They were not available. Pompey had 2 veteran legions in Italy, both of them in a detail that would have seemed darkly comic if the situation had admitted of comedy, recently transferred from Caesar's own Gallic command, but the bulk of his military strength was in Spain, under his lieutenants, and the recruitment of new forces in Italy required time that Caesar's speed of movement was not going to provide. When the news of the Rubicon crossing reached Rome, Pompey's assessment of the situation was honest enough to be alarming. He told the Senate that he could not defend the city with the forces currently at hand. The Senate absorbed this information and began packing. Caesar moved south along the Adriatic coast with a velocity that his sources treat as a deliberate strategic instrument, which it was. Towns surrendered before his advance guard arrived. Garrison commanders sent word that they would not fight. The population of northern Italy, which had lived under Caesar's provincial administration for 9 years and had received land distributions and citizenship extensions from his consulship, responded to his approach with something considerably warmer than resistance. Corfinium, where a Pompeian commander named Domitius Ahenobarbus had assembled 30 cohorts and declared his intention to hold, fell when his own troops mutinied and delivered him to Caesar. Caesar released him. He released every captured soldier who would swear not to fight against him, and released most of the commanders as well, a policy of clementia, that was both genuinely principled and precisely calculated, since every pardoned enemy was an advertisement directed at the enemies who had not yet surrendered. Pompey reached Brundisium on the heel of Italy and began organizing the crossing to Greece. He had concluded, and the conclusion was strategically defensible, whatever its political cost, that Italy was not worth defending with insufficient forces, that Greece offered the space and the eastern client kingdoms offered the resources to build the army that could actually defeat Caesar, and that a temporary abandonment of Rome was preferable to a defeat inside it. Caesar pursued him to Brundisium and attempted to seal the harbor with a mole of earth and timber, while Pompey's transports ferried troops across the Adriatic. The engineering was impressive. It was not quite fast enough. Pompey got his forces across, sailed on the last transport himself, and left Caesar standing on the Italian shore, looking at an empty harbor and a war that had just become considerably longer and more complicated. Rome received Caesar without fighting, which was not the same thing as receiving him with enthusiasm. The city was unsettled. Pompey's departure had been read by many of its inhabitants as either a strategic masterstroke or an abandonment, depending on their political sympathies, and neither reading was comfortable. Caesar addressed the Senate with the members who had remained, spoke of peace and reconciliation, and was met with the cautious silence of men who were waiting to see which way the situation resolved before committing their public positions. He took what he needed from the state treasury. The tribune Metellus attempted to block the treasury door and was told by Caesar, with the compressed impatience of a man who had crossed the Rubicon 2 months earlier and was not going to be stopped by a single tribune at a door, that it was easier for him to do this than to say it, and turned west. Spain first. Pompey's lieutenants Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius commanded 7 veteran legions in the Iberian Peninsula, and leaving that force intact at his back while he crossed to Greece to fight Pompey would have been the kind of strategic error that Caesar's career contained almost none of. He moved through the south of France in weeks, crossed the Pyrenees, and found Afranius and Petreius encamped on high ground near Ilerda, in the valley of the Segre River in northeastern Spain. The campaign that followed was decided less by pitched battle than by the methodical engineering and supply management at which Caesar's army had become expert during 9 years in Gaul. He cut their water supply, maneuvered them away from their base, and eventually surrounded them in a waterless position, from which the only exit was surrender. The 2 commanders capitulated in August 49 BCE. Caesar discharged their soldiers and let the commanders go, consistent with the clementia policy that was becoming the war's defining political gesture. He had secured his western flank in roughly 3 months without a major engagement. Greece was next, and Greece was harder. Caesar crossed the Adriatic in January 48 BCE, in winter, when the crossing was genuinely dangerous, because Pompey's naval superiority made a summer crossing potentially fatal, and Caesar had concluded that surprise in the wrong season was preferable to predictability in the right one. He landed with part of his force on the Epirote coast, found Pompey's army already positioned and considerably larger than his own, and settled into a campaign of maneuvering and entrenchment along the coast near the town of Dyrrhachium. He attempted to surround Pompey's larger force with a line of fortifications, the same circumvallation logic that had worked at Alesia, and came close enough to making it work that Pompey spent weeks inside the perimeter before a breach in Caesar's line, exploited by a night attack, turned the situation. Caesar's army was driven back in what he himself acknowledged was a serious defeat, and Pompey, reportedly told by his subordinates that Caesar's army was broken and should be pursued immediately, advanced too cautiously, giving Caesar the hours needed to rally and withdraw in order. Caesar told his officers afterward that the war could have ended that day if Pompey had known how to take a victory. Pompey knew how to take a victory. He was being careful, and his caution came from a place that Caesar understood better than Pompey's subordinates did. Pompey had too much to lose in a defeat to risk everything on a pursuit. Caesar had nothing to lose in a defeat that he could not already lose in a slow attrition. The strategic asymmetry between them had been visible since the Rubicon, and at Dyrrhachium it became tactically decisive. Both armies moved inland into Thessaly in the summer heat of 48 BCE. The decisive battle was fought on August 9th on the plain near the town of Pharsalus, a relatively featureless agricultural plain that offered neither side a particular geographic advantage and that suited Caesar's tactical preference for engagements where legionary discipline and personal command could operate without interference from terrain. Pompey's force outnumbered Caesar's roughly 2 to 1, perhaps 45,000 infantry against 22,000, with considerably more cavalry. His plan turned on the cavalry superiority, a massed charge on Caesar's right flank that would roll up the line while the infantry engaged frontally. Caesar had anticipated this. He had drawn 6 cohorts from his third line and positioned them obliquely behind his right flank, concealed from Pompey's view, with instructions to use their javelins not as throwing weapons, but as thrusting spears aimed at the faces of the cavalry. The faces specifically, since cavalry horses and their riders both tend to flinch from threats to the eyes. When Pompey's cavalry charge came in, Caesar's hidden cohorts rose, the javelins went up into the riders' faces, and the cavalry, largely composed of young Roman aristocrats whose military experience was social rather than professional, broke and fled. Caesar's third line, fresh and uncommitted, swung around the exposed flank. Pompey's army collapsed. Pompey himself left the battle before it was fully resolved. He rode to his camp, sat briefly in his command tent in silence, while the sounds of his army's disintegration reached him through the leather walls, removed his general's cloak, and departed without speaking to anyone. He reached the coast, found a ship, collected his wife Cornelia from Lesbos. She had been waiting there since Dyrrhachium at his insistence, and sailed east toward Egypt, toward the court of the young king Ptolemy XIII, where he believed his long relationship with the Egyptian royal family entitled him to refuge and assistance. The Egyptians debated his arrival while his ship waited offshore. Ptolemy XIII was 13 years old. His decisions made by the council of advisors, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, the rhetorician Theodotus, who governed in his name and who concluded, after the kind of calculation that courts make when great men arrive diminished, that a dead Pompey was a safer proposition than a live one. Theodotus reportedly argued that dead men do not bite. On September 28, 48 BCE, as Pompey's small boat approached the Egyptian shore near Pelusium, the Roman officer Lucius Septimius, who had served under Pompey years earlier in the East, and whose presence on the boat was presumably intended to reassure, drove a sword into his back. Pompey had time to pull his toga over his face before he died, a gesture that the sources record with the attention due to a man who understood, at the last moment, the importance of how one was seen. His head was cut off and preserved. His body was left on the beach. His freedman Philippus, who had been in the boat, waited until the Egyptians had gone, gathered driftwood from the shore, built a small pyre, cremated what remained, and collected the ashes. It was, in its material dimensions, a modest end for a man who had reorganized the eastern Mediterranean and been called the Great since his mid-20s. Caesar arrived in Alexandria 3 days later, pursuing a man who was already dead. The Egyptians presented him with Pompey's head and signet ring. Caesar wept. The sources note this carefully and debate it equally carefully, some attributing genuine grief to a man who had known Pompey for decades and had been his son-in-law's father, others attributing political calculation to a man who had obvious reasons to appear magnanimous toward a defeated rival. The weeping was probably both, which is not a contradiction but a description of how complicated men function in extreme circumstances. He turned away from the head and did not look at it again. The war was not over. Pompey's supporters remained in the field across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, where Metellus Scipio and Cato had assembled a substantial force with the backing of the Numidian king Juba, and in Spain, where Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus were rebuilding a western base. Before Caesar could reach them, he would spend 9 months in Egypt, entangled in a war he had not planned and a relationship he had not anticipated, in a city that was the most extraordinary on earth and that was currently engaged in a civil war of its own. The campaigns against his remaining enemies would take 3 more years and carry him to North Africa and back to Spain before the war's last battle, at Munda in 45 BCE, where he reportedly told his officers afterward that he had fought many times for victory, but at Munda he had fought for his life. Cato did not wait for Munda. After the defeat at Thapsus in North Africa in April 46 BCE, with Caesar's legions closing on the city of Utica where he had made his final stand, Cato spent the evening reading Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue on the immortality of the soul, went to bed, and woke in the night to complete what the sources are unanimous in calling a deliberate and philosophical death by his own hand. He refused to live under Caesar's rule, and the refusal was entirely in character, as principled and as inflexible as everything else he had ever done. Caesar, when the news reached him, is reported to have said that he envied Cato the opportunity, that Cato had saved his own dignity by dying before he could be pardoned, and that Caesar would have been deprived of the satisfaction of pardoning him. The remark is probably invented. It is also, in its understanding of both men's positions, exactly right. The civil war ended in the spring of 45 BCE with Munda and the death of Gnaeus Pompey the Younger in its aftermath. Caesar returned to Rome the last man standing in a conflict that had consumed a generation of the Roman aristocracy. Crossing the world he had spent 9 years fighting across and arriving in a city that was now, in the only sense that mattered, entirely his. What he would do with it was a question that Rome was only beginning to ask, and that Caesar himself may not have fully answered. Chapter 8: Caesar in Egypt. Cleopatra VII had been queen of Egypt for 3 years when Caesar arrived in Alexandria, and she had spent the last several months of those 3 years in exile. The circumstances of her removal were straightforward in their political logic, if not in their personal bitterness. Her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, guided by the council of advisers who governed in the name of a 13-year-old king, had moved against her when her independent authority began to look more like a competing power than a co-regency, and she had withdrawn eastward toward the Syrian border, assembling what forces she could, waiting for the moment that the situation might change. She was 21 years old, the first Ptolemaic ruler in the dynasty's 3-century history to bother learning Egyptian, and she also spoke Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Parthian, and several other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean world, a linguistic range that reflected something deliberate about how she understood her role, which was not as a Greek aristocrat governing a foreign population from a comfortable distance, but as an Egyptian monarch in the fuller sense that the title implied. She had been trained for exactly this position since childhood, and she had lost it to a council of men who believed a young woman's authority could be managed as conveniently as a young boy's. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria changed the calculation. He came as a Roman consul with legal authority over the kingdom's affairs. Egypt was not yet a Roman province, but its fiscal relationship with Rome and the personal debts of the Ptolemaic dynasty to Roman creditors gave Rome a standing in Egyptian domestic politics that the dynasty had been managing for decades. Ptolemy XIII's council understood this. Their solution to Pompey's arrival had been a head and a signet ring. Their solution to Caesar's was considerably more difficult to formulate, since Caesar arrived with legions and with the full weight of Roman authority behind him, and delivering his head was not among the available options. Cleopatra understood the situation with the precision of a woman who had been studying it from a border camp for months. She needed to reach Caesar before her brother's people did, needed to make her case in person before the council had the opportunity to shape his understanding of the Egyptian succession dispute in their preferred direction. The route into Alexandria was controlled by Ptolemy's forces. Direct approach was impossible. The solution she devised, or that was devised by someone in her camp with a talent for logistics and a theatrical instinct, was to have herself rolled inside a length of bedding, or a carpet, or a large linen sack, depending on which ancient source is followed, and transported into the palace quarter as ordinary cargo by a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, who had the kind of access to the palace district that a queen in exile did not. The sources disagree on the precise material. They agree on the basic architecture of the plan: concealment, transport, delivery, emergence, and on Caesar's reported response when the bundle was unrolled before him, which was something close to immediate fascination. Whether that fascination was political, personal, or some combination that neither word adequately describes is a question the ancient sources answer according to their own purposes and that cannot be resolved from the evidence available. What is clear is that Caesar supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne, that he summoned Ptolemy XIII to negotiate the co-regency's restoration, and that Ptolemy's council, Pothinus particularly, responded to this development with the decision that Caesar himself needed to be removed from the equation. Pothinus sent word to the general Achillas, who was outside the city with the bulk of the Egyptian army, to march on Alexandria. The Alexandrian War that followed was not Rome's most elegant military operation. Caesar found himself holding the palace quarter of a vast hostile city with perhaps 4,000 soldiers, cut off from reinforcement, fighting a series of engagements through the city's streets and harbor that lasted from late 48 BCE into the spring of 47 BCE. The harbor fighting produced the incident that ancient sources have debated ever since: fire spreading from Caesar's ships to the waterfront buildings, and from the waterfront to the nearby warehouse district where thousands of scrolls from the great library's overflow collections were stored. The library itself, the main institution on the Bruttian quarter, survived. What burned was a substantial commercial book warehouse near the docks, which was a significant loss and not the same catastrophe as the burning of the library proper, though the centuries have tended to collapse the distinction. Caesar's own account of the Alexandrian War, written in the third person with the customary composure, does not linger on the fire. Pothinus was discovered passing intelligence to Achillas and was executed on Caesar's orders. Achaeus was subsequently killed by Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, who had escaped the palace and joined the Egyptian forces outside with her own claim to the throne and her own ambitions about how the succession dispute should resolve. Arsinoe's general Ganymede replaced Achillas and proved a more capable opponent, cutting the palace quarters' fresh water supply by engineering salt water into the cisterns, forcing Caesar's engineers to dig wells inside the perimeter. The harbor fighting continued. Caesar's relief force arrived through the Nile Delta. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the final battle, weighed down, the sources suggest, by his armor. The war was over. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, paired now with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, a child of 11, in a co-regency that gave the arrangement constitutional form while making its practical nature clear. Caesar remained in Egypt for 9 months. He did not need to remain for 9 months. The military situation was resolved by the spring of 47 BCE, and the Eastern Mediterranean had other pressing claims on his attention. The 9 months are a fact that the sources note without entirely explaining, and that later writers have filled variously with love, politics, tourism, and the Nile. The Nile journey is attested. Caesar and Cleopatra traveled upriver together on the royal barge, accompanied by a fleet of some 400 vessels, passing through the Egyptian countryside that no Roman of Caesar's standing had ever seen in this way, at this pace, in this company. The river in the spring carries the accumulated snow of the Ethiopian highlands southward through the delta, and the fields on either bank show the particular deep green that the annual inundation produces, and the temples at Dendera and Karnak rise from the flat agricultural plain with the patient authority of structures that had been standing for 2,000 years when Caesar passed them. Whether he registered the antiquity is not recorded. He was a man who engaged with the present with great thoroughness, and the present, on the royal barge in the spring of 47 BCE, contained Cleopatra. Caesarion, Ptolemy 15 Caesar, was born in June of 47 BCE. His paternity was claimed by Cleopatra and acknowledged by the Egyptian court throughout his short life. Caesar never formally acknowledged him in Rome, where the acknowledgement of a foreign-born child had no legal standing anyway, but he also never denied the claim, and in a man of Caesar's precision, the non-denial was a form of answer. Caesarion lived until 30 BCE, when Octavian had him killed, efficiently, without drama, on the reasonable grounds that there could only be one Caesar, and that a living son of Julius Caesar However politically inconvenient the paternity was a structural problem that the new order could not afford to leave unresolved. Caesar left Egypt in the summer of 47 BCE and moved northeast with a relatively small force toward a problem that had developed in Pontus, the kingdom on the southern shore of the Black Sea, while Roman attention had been directed elsewhere. Pharnaces, too, the son of the great Mithridates, who had been Rome's most persistent eastern enemy for 30 years, had used the distraction of the civil war to reclaim much of his father's former territory, defeating a Roman force and advancing through Asia Minor with a confidence that reflected his assessment of Rome's current capacity to respond. His assessment was reasonable based on the previous 2 years. It did not account for Caesar. The Battle of Zela, fought in August 47 BCE in the highlands of Pontus, lasted approximately 4 hours. Caesar's forces attacked uphill, a choice that surprised Pharnaces, who had positioned himself on the high ground, expecting to hold the advantage, and the attack's momentum, combined with the Pontic army's failure to consolidate its position before the Romans closed, produced a collapse so rapid that Caesar's own account of it has a note of almost comic compression. The dispatch he sent to his friend Gaius Macius in Rome, Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, is the most efficient battle report in the history of military correspondence. 3 words in Latin, each a perfect first-person singular, perfect indicative, the grammar itself enacting the compression. It has been quoted so continuously for 2,000 years that the effort required to hear it fresh is considerable, but the effort is worth making. It is a genuinely extraordinary thing to have written, and it was written by a man who understood exactly how extraordinary it was and wrote it anyway, which tells you something about Caesar's relationship to his own legend that longer analyses frequently miss. He returned to Rome in the autumn of 47 BCE, to a city that had been managing without him for 9 months, with the imperfect instruments he had left in place, and that had accumulated in his absence a set of political and financial crises that the instruments had not been adequate to resolve. His own veterans, encamped outside the city, had mutinied over their discharge bonuses and land grants, promises made and deferred, in the way that promises to soldiers are deferred when the campaigns keep extending. Caesar walked into their assembly at the Campus Martius, let the noise settle, and addressed them as quirites, civilians, rather than milites, soldiers. The word landed as he intended. Men who had crossed the Alps in winter and built 25 miles of fortification at Alesia and fought through the streets of Alexandria did not think of themselves as civilians, and being called civilians by the man they had done all of that for and with was a more precise instrument than any threat. The mutiny dissolved. The veterans re-enlisted. He had 4 campaigns still ahead of him, Africa, and then his triumphs, and then Spain, and then the work of governing the world he had spent 15 years acquiring. But the 9 months in Egypt had produced something that would outlast most of what the campaigns produced. Cleopatra came to Rome in 46 BCE, installed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, received by the city with the particular Roman mixture of fascination and ostentatious disapproval that the city reserved for foreign queens and their implications. She was still there when Caesar died. She left shortly after, taking Caesarion and the problem of her dynasty's survival back to Alexandria, where she would spend the next 17 years finding the next Roman who could be persuaded that the interests of Egypt and the interests of his own ambition ran in the same direction. She was right about Caesar. She would be right about Antony. She would not find a third. Chapter 9: Governing the World. The machinery of Roman governance in 46 BCE was a collection of institutions designed for a city-state attempting to administer an empire, and the gap between those two purposes had been producing friction for a century without anyone quite resolving it. The Senate met and passed decrees that provincial governors received weeks or months after the situations the decrees addressed had already changed. Magistrates elected annually in Rome arrived in their provinces without knowledge of local conditions, governed for 12 months, and departed before the consequences of their decisions became fully visible. Tax collection in the eastern provinces was contracted to private companies, the publicani, whose interests in maximizing extraction were structurally misaligned with the interests of stable provincial administration. The grain supply for a city of perhaps 1 million people depended on a distribution system that had been reformed repeatedly since the Gratian era and that still managed, with remarkable regularity, to produce crises. Caesar looked at all of this with the attention of a man who had spent 9 years governing Gaul and understood what functional administration actually required, and he set about the work of reform with the compressed energy of someone who suspected, correctly, that he did not have unlimited time. The dictatorship was his legal instrument. The office was a genuine constitutional provision, a temporary grant of supreme authority in genuine emergencies, with a built-in time limit of 6 months and a tradition of voluntary resignation well before the limit expired. Sulla had held it. Caesar held it first in 49 BCE for 11 days, long enough to conduct the consular elections, then again after Pharsalus, then again after Thapsus, each appointment slightly longer and slightly less emergency shaped than the one before. In February 44 BCE, the Senate appointed him dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, without a time limit, without a built-in expiration, without the constitutional fiction of temporary emergency that had made the earlier appointments technically defensible. The appointment was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the previous 2 years. It was nevertheless a threshold, and the men in the Senate who voted for it and the men who voted against it both understood that the threshold had been crossed. Between the dictatorship's legal framework and the genuine work of reform, the years 46 and 45 BCE produced a legislative output of considerable scale. The calendar came first, because the calendar affected everything else. The Roman calendar had been drifting from the solar year for generations. It was a lunar calendar that nominally tracked the sun through periodic intercalation of extra months, a process managed by the pontifices, who had been inserting and omitting intercalary months for political reasons, extending the terms of friendly magistrates, shortening the terms of hostile ones, until the calendar and the actual seasons had diverged by several months. It was autumn by the solar year and high summer by the Roman calendar, or winter by the calendar and harvest time by the actual sun, and the confusion had practical consequences for everything from agricultural planning to the scheduling of religious festivals whose timing was meant to align with the agricultural cycle they celebrated. Caesar consulted Sosigenes of Alexandria, an Egyptian astronomer whose specific biography is largely lost, but whose competence is attested by the result. The solution Sosigenes proposed was elegant in its fundamentals. Abandon the lunar calendar entirely, fix the year at 365 days, add 1 day every fourth year to account for the solar year's actual length of 365 and a quarter days, and distribute the days among 12 months in the proportions that have been standard in the Western world ever since. The transition required 46 BCE to run for 445 days, 2 intercalary months inserted to realign the calendar with the actual solar position, a year that Romans called the year of confusion, though the confusion was the remedy rather than the disease. When the Julian calendar came into effect on January 1st, 45 BCE, it was accurate to within 11 minutes of the true solar year, a margin not corrected until the Gregorian reform of 1582. The calendar Caesar fixed in 46 days of administrative work remained the organizational framework of Western civilization for 16 centuries. The grain dole was reformed and extended, the rolls audited and corrected. Caesar reduced the number of recipients from roughly 320,000 to around 150,000, not by cutting the poor off from support, but by removing the dead, the duplicates, and the well-connected who had registered through patronage rather than need, and then distributing the savings in increased allocations to those who remained. Debt relief came next, in a form that navigated the genuinely difficult political economy of the late Republic's debt crisis. Creditors had to accept properties at pre-war valuations as settlement for outstanding loans, a measure that satisfied neither side fully, but reduced the most extreme cases of debt bondage without the wholesale cancellation that the most indebted faction had been demanding and that would have collapsed the credit system entirely. 80,000 Roman citizens were settled in colonies outside Italy, in Spain, in North Africa, in Greece, in Asia Minor, a dispersal that simultaneously relieved urban overcrowding, rewarded veterans with land, and extended Roman civic culture into the provinces in ways that would matter for centuries. The Senate's membership was raised from roughly 600 to 900, filled with Caesar's provincial allies, his veteran officers, his Gallic clients, and various other men whose connection to the traditional Roman aristocracy was loose enough that the old guard found the expansion visually offensive. Cicero, who had accepted Caesar's pardon after Pharsalus and retired to his estates to write philosophy, noted in his letters that he had encountered newly minted senators at dinner parties who were unfamiliar with the streets of Rome and had needed directions to the Senate house. The observation was made with the particular sourness of a man who had spent his career navigating the Senate's social hierarchies and now found those hierarchies populated by men who had acquired their seats through military service in Gaul rather than through the cursus honorum. He was also, in the same letters, careful to acknowledge that many of Caesar's reforms were sensible. Cicero's private correspondence has the virtue of honesty that his public speeches sometimes sacrificed for effect. The four triumphs of September 46 BCE ran across 4 consecutive days and covered the 4 major campaigns: Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, Africa, each with its procession of spoils and captives, and the elaborate theatrical machinery that Roman triumphal tradition had developed over centuries. The Gallic triumph displayed Vercingetorix, who had been held in the Tullianum prison in Rome since his capture at Alesia 6 years earlier, kept alive specifically for this occasion. He processed through the streets of Rome in chains, displayed to a crowd that had been reading about him in Caesar's commentary for years, and was now seeing the man himself, still bearing himself by all accounts, with a dignity that the sources register in the same neutral tone they use for the measurements of Caesar's fortifications. After the triumph, he was returned to the Tullianum and executed, which was the standard end for captive enemy commanders displayed in Roman triumphs, and which the sources note without particular comment. He had been a genuinely formidable adversary, and he died as such things ended in Rome. The gold and silver displayed in the four triumphs, the paintings of battles and cities, and geographical features of the conquered territories, the exotic animals and the foreign prisoners, and the model ships, and the towers of coins. All of this moved through the streets of Rome across 4 days and produced in the watching population something between civic pride and vertigo, the particular Roman feeling of having consumed more of the world than could be comfortably digested. Caesar distributed money to his soldiers, to the urban poor, to the citizens on the grain dole. The specific figures vary by source, but the scale was large enough that grain and oil prices in the city dropped temporarily from the influx of purchasing power. He staged gladiatorial games and animal hunts on a scale that made his aedileship spectacles look preliminary. A mock naval battle was staged on an artificial lake dug in the Campus Martius, with warships crewed by prisoners of war and condemned criminals who fought to the death in front of an audience of perhaps 150,000 people. Through all of this ran the growing question that no reform could answer and no triumph could dissolve, which was what Caesar intended to do next. The dictatorship perpetua was one signal. The golden chair that he sat on in the Senate was another. The month Quintilis had been renamed July in his honor, the first month in Roman history to bear a living man's name. At the Lupercalia festival in February 44 BCE, the festival of the god Lupercus held on the Palatine Hill, Antony, who was consul that year and Caesar's most visible political ally, ran the traditional naked route through the streets, wearing only a goatskin girdle and carrying a leather thong, as the festival required, and at its conclusion appeared before Caesar's throne on the rostra and held up a laurel wreath wound with a white ribbon, a diadem, the symbol of kingship. Caesar pushed it away. The crowd cheered. Antony offered it again. Caesar pushed it away again and ordered it taken to the Capitol and dedicated to Jupiter. The king of the gods could wear it. No Roman could. The crowd cheered again, more loudly. The ancient sources debate the sincerity of the refusal endlessly, and the debate cannot be resolved from the evidence available. What can be said with confidence is that the gesture, the offer, the refusal, the crowd's response was not spontaneous. Both men knew it was going to happen. Both men knew what each possible response would communicate. Caesar's refusal was performed in front of the maximum possible audience with the maximum possible deliberateness, and if it was intended to end the question of the kingship, it ended it only in the specific technical sense that he had not accepted the specific object on that specific day, which is not the same thing as ending the question. The senators who were already meeting in small groups at each other's houses to discuss what to do about Caesar were not reassured by the Lupercalia performance. They were, if anything, further convinced that the performance was a performance, and that the diadem was going to come back in a different form at a different moment. Caesar knew there was a conspiracy. Hints had reached him through the usual channels of Roman political intelligence: freedmen who overheard conversations, slaves who carried messages, clients who reported what their patrons were discussing at dinner. He dismissed his Spanish bodyguard. He told those who pressed him on the subject that he would rather die once than live indefinitely in fear of dying. The remark has the quality of something he actually said, the specific compression of a man who had been making calculated bets on his own survival since he was 17 years old and hiding in the Sabine Hills from Sulla's agents. He continued attending the Senate. He signed off on plans to leave Rome in March for a Parthian campaign that would avenge Crassus and extend Roman power into the east, a campaign that several ancient sources suggest he saw as the project that would give his dictatorship its ultimate justification, an achievement so large that the question of what he was would be answered by what he had done. He had governed the world for 2 years and reformed more of its machinery than any single Roman before him, and the question of what he was remained, at the opening of 44 BCE, as unanswered as it had been when he crossed the Rubicon. The Ides of March were 5 weeks away, and in the rooms where the conspiracy was assembling itself, the answer was being decided without him. Chapter 10: The Ides of March. The Ides of March fell on the 15th, and the Senate was scheduled to meet that morning in the great hall attached to the Theater of Pompey on the Campus Martius, where the senators had been convening while the Curia Julia, Caesar's own building project in the old Forum, remained under construction. The choice of venue had been made weeks earlier for administrative reasons and had not been changed when the conspiracy settled on the date, which meant that 23 men who intended to kill Julius Caesar would do so in a room built by and named for the man Caesar had defeated at Pharsalus, and whose head had been presented to Caesar on an Egyptian beach. The ancient sources note this detail with the careful neutrality of writers who understand that some ironies require no elaboration. The conspiracy had coalesced around two men whose characters were different enough that their alliance required explanation, and similar enough that the explanation was not difficult to find. Gaius Cassius Longinus was a soldier and a pragmatist. He had commanded Crassus's cavalry at Carrhae, escaped the slaughter that killed his commander, and spent the subsequent years serving the Republic in whatever military capacity was available, fighting for Pompey at Pharsalus and receiving Caesar's pardon afterward with a gratitude he apparently found difficult to sustain. His opposition to Caesar was not primarily philosophical. It was the opposition of a capable man who understood power clearly and concluded that Caesar's continued existence was incompatible with his own future and with any future in which the Senate retained meaningful authority. Cassius organized the conspiracy, recruited its members, managed its logistics, and worried throughout about the gap between what needed to happen on the Ides and what would happen in Rome the day after. Marcus Junius Brutus was something different. He was a man of genuine philosophical seriousness, a Stoic in the tradition that took the school's ethics as a practical guide rather than an intellectual exercise, who had written treatises on virtue, corresponded with Cicero about the obligations of public life, and carried in his family history the weight of an ancestor named Lucius Junius Brutus, who had expelled the last Roman king in 509 BCE and founded the republic whose protection was now, in Marcus Brutus's reading of his situation, his specific inherited obligation. His mother Servilia had been Caesar's intimate companion for years. The relationship was one of the worst kept secrets in Rome, acknowledged by everyone and discussed with the particular Roman combination of discretion and complete awareness. Caesar had pardoned Brutus after Pharsalus, despite his having fought for Pompey, had favored him with the praetorship of the city, and had treated him with a consistent personal warmth that makes Brutus's participation in the conspiracy the most psychologically complex element of the entire episode. He joined because he believed it was right. That belief was sincere, and it was catastrophically insufficient for what came after. The circle widened through January and February of 44 BCE with the careful selectivity that conspiracy requires, enough members to carry out the act, few enough to prevent the kind of information leak that brings conspiracies to light before they ripen. 23 senators eventually knew. Among them was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, not closely related to Marcus Brutus, despite the shared name, who had been one of Caesar's most trusted commanders in Gaul, who had governed provinces at Caesar's appointment, and whose participation in the conspiracy was the detail that Caesar, if he had known it, might have found most difficult to absorb. Decimus Brutus was not a stoic philosopher acting on principle. He was a practical man who had concluded, for reasons the sources do not fully illuminate, that Caesar's removal was both necessary and achievable, and who would play a specific and crucial role on the morning of the Ides by going personally to Caesar's house to escort him to the Senate when reports of bad omens seemed to be delaying his departure. Caesar had not been well in the days preceding the Ides. He suffered periodically from what ancient sources describe as falling sickness, episodes that Suetonius reports occurred under stress and that modern interpreters have variously identified as epilepsy or other neurological conditions, without the evidence to be definitive. Calpurnia had dreamed badly. In her dream, the pediment of their house had collapsed, an image of structural ruin, vivid enough that she woke and asked Caesar not to go to the Senate that morning. He had been inclined, the sources suggest, to comply, not necessarily from belief in the dream's significance, but from the general unease of a man who had received enough indirect warnings about the conspiracy that some caution had accumulated even without specific knowledge. Decimus Brutus arrived at the house while Caesar was still considering the matter, dismissed the omens with the brisk practicality of a general who had shared campaigns with Caesar for a decade, and walked him out of the door. The streets of Rome on the morning of the Ides were carrying their normal traffic. The city moved early, the markets and the law courts and the porticos where business was conducted all filling by first light, the population of perhaps 1 million people engaged in the ordinary commerce of an ordinary Roman morning. Caesar moved through this in his litter, accompanied by the friends and clients and petitioners who habitually attached themselves to his movements through the city. A haruspex named Spurina had warned him weeks earlier, during a sacrifice, that he should beware the Ides of March. The story is attested in multiple sources and was almost certainly known to Caesar, who reputedly greeted Spurina that morning with the observation that the Ides had come. Spurina's reported reply, that they had come but not yet gone, has the quality of a story improved by the telling, and may be authentic regardless. At the theater of Pompey, the conspirators had arranged themselves with the self-consciousness of men performing an act they had rehearsed in their minds many times. They carried blades concealed beneath their togas. The senatorial toga provided, in its voluminous folds, sufficient concealment for a short blade without altering the garment's silhouette in ways that a casual observer would notice. Antony, who was consul and Caesar's most visible ally, and who, if present, might have intervened or at least complicated the timing, had been detained outside the hall by Decimus Brutus's confederate Trebonius, engaged in a conversation that lasted precisely as long as it needed to last. Caesar entered the hall and took his seat. The conspirators gathered around him under the cover of a petition. One of them, Tillius Cimber, approached with a request regarding his exiled brother, a request Caesar had already considered and declined, and Cimber pressed the matter with the insistence appropriate to a man whose actual purpose was to hold Caesar's attention and his hands, while the others positioned themselves. When Cimber seized Caesar's toga and pulled it from his shoulder, the signal, Publius Servilius Casca, standing behind Caesar, drove his blade into the side of Caesar's neck. The wound was not immediately fatal. Caesar grabbed Casca's arm, drove his stylus, the bronze writing tool he carried, into Casca's arm, and rose. Then the others came in from every side simultaneously, and what followed was not the clean act of tyrannicide that Brutus had imagined during the weeks of planning, but a confused and violent press of 23 men with blades in a space that was not large, each of them delivering a wound that was partly practical and partly a signature, a commitment, a burning of the bridge between the old arrangement and whatever came next. Several of the conspirators wounded each other in the chaos. Caesar, receiving wound after wound, pulled his toga over his face, as Pompey had pulled his over his own face on the Egyptian shore, and fell at the base of the statue of Pompey that stood in the hall. 23 wounds in total. The autopsy conducted by the physician Antistius, reported by Suetonius, concluded that only one had been immediately fatal, a wound to the chest, and that Caesar might have survived the others. He was 55 years old. The Senate fled. The conspirators stood in the emptied hall, their blades still drawn, the body of Julius Caesar at the foot of Pompey's statue, and discovered in that moment what Cassius had worried about throughout the weeks of planning, that they had prepared the act with care and prepared almost nothing that came after it. They had no speech ready for the forum. They had not coordinated with the Senate's majority. They had not arranged the disposition of Caesar's legions, his treasury, his provincial governors, or the consul Antony, who was now free of Trebonius's conversation and was somewhere in the building processing the news that his patron and friend had been killed 30 feet from where he had been standing. Brutus had argued throughout the planning that Antony should be spared, that killing only Caesar was the philosophically defensible act, tyrannicide rather than mere political murder, and that Antony's death alongside Caesar's would look like a coup rather than a liberation. Cassius had disagreed. Brutus had prevailed. The body lay on the floor of the hall for 3 hours before Caesar's slaves arrived with a litter and carried it home through the streets of a city that had not yet decided what it felt. Calpurnia was waiting. 3 hours. In those 3 hours, the republic that the liberatores believed they had restored began to demonstrate, with the remorseless clarity of events, that it had not been waiting behind Caesar's dictatorship for the opportunity to re-emerge. It had been gone for longer than the conspirators understood, and the act they had committed had not brought it back. It had simply opened a space into which everything that came next would rush. Antony held Caesar's papers. Antony held the consulship. And Antony, standing in whatever room he had found to absorb the morning's events, was already thinking about the funeral. Chapter 11. Antony and the Chaos After. Antony stood at the rostra on March 20th, 5 days after the assassination, and the forum below him held a crowd whose mood was not yet settled into anything that could be named with confidence. The city had spent those 5 days in the particular suspended state that follows a violent political rupture, the markets open, the law courts technically sitting, the ordinary commerce of 1,000,000 lives continuing because it had nowhere else to go, while underneath all of it ran the current of uncertainty that everyone felt and no one had yet resolved into action. The conspirators had addressed the crowd from the Capitol on the afternoon of the Ides themselves, Brutus speaking with the measured civic gravity of a man who had done what he believed was right and expected that belief to be legible to anyone who listened carefully. The crowd had been silent, not hostile, not approving, silent in the way that crowds are silent when they are waiting for information they do not yet have about which way to move. The Senate's response in the days immediately following was a compromise so structurally unstable that it is remarkable it lasted even as long as it did. Caesar's acts were confirmed, his laws, his appointments, his grants of citizenship, his colonial settlements all remained in force, which suited everyone who had benefited from them, and which also suited Antony, who held Caesar's papers and whose ability to produce, or not produce, documentation of Caesar's intentions gave him a practical authority over Roman politics that the compromise had inadvertently handed him. The conspirators received amnesty. Neither side was disarmed, neither side was prosecuted, and the central question of what Caesar's death actually meant for the Republic's future was left entirely unaddressed, on the theory that addressing it would require choosing between answers that neither faction was prepared to impose by force that particular week. Into this arrangement, Antony introduced the will. Caesar had deposited his will with the Vestal Virgins, the standard practice for Romans of sufficient standing, since the Vestal's religious authority gave the document a protection that private custody could not. Antony retrieved it and had it read publicly in his own house 3 days after the assassination, in front of an audience of senators and clients whose reactions he could observe and whose reports would reach the forum before morning. The contents were not secret. Wills in Rome were social documents as much as legal ones, and Caesar's had been anticipated in general terms by those who knew him well. But hearing the specific figures in sequence, in the formal language of the document itself, produced an effect that general anticipation had not prepared the city for. Every Roman citizen received 75 denarii. The figure was not enormous, roughly 3 weeks' wages for a laborer, a month's for a skilled craftsman, but it was specific, personal, and immediate, in a way that political abstractions were not. Caesar had been killed 5 days ago, and his will was giving money directly to the people of Rome, bypassing the Senate, bypassing the magistrates, bypassing every institutional channel through which aristocratic generosity normally flowed and was managed, and had its political character shaped by the intermediaries who delivered it. The public gardens on the Janiculum, which Caesar had developed at considerable personal expense, were bequeathed to the Roman people as permanent public space. The will also named Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, currently completing military studies in Apollonia across the Adriatic, as his principal heir and adopted son, a provision whose consequences no one in the room reading the will that evening could have fully traced. Antony had secured permission from the Senate to deliver a funeral oration over the objections of Cassius and with Brutus's concurrence, on the grounds that denying a Roman of Caesar's standing a public funeral would itself look like an act of tyranny rather than liberation. Brutus concurred because he believed, with the sincerity and the miscalculation that ran through everything he did in these weeks, that Antony's grief was personal rather than political, that the oration would be a conventional expression of mourning rather than a political instrument, and that the crowd would hear it as such. Cassius did not believe this, and said so, and was overruled. Antony was not a philosopher. He was a soldier and a politician, and a man of considerable personal force, who had been Caesar's close ally for years, and who was now standing at the center of a political situation that he understood with a clarity that Brutus's philosophical framework could not quite see. He brought Caesar's body to the rostra on a bier. He had the wounds displayed. He held up the toga, the one Caesar had pulled over his face as he fell, still carrying the cuts and the blood of 23 blades, and moved it slowly so that the crowd could see each tear in the cloth and understand what each tear meant in terms of a specific man's body on a specific floor. He read the will aloud again, in public, so that every citizen present could hear the 75 denarii and the public gardens spoken in the forum, rather than in a private house. He did not, as far as the sources indicate, fabricate his grief. He had known Caesar for years, had served under him and alongside him, had been trusted with the consulship in the year that Caesar intended to leave for Parthia, and the loss was real in addition to being politically useful. The two things arrived at exactly the same gestures, which is not the same as saying either one was false. The forum erupted, not in the organized way of a political movement, but in the immediate, ungovernable way of a crowd whose accumulated tension finds a single point of release. Caesar's body was carried by the crowd to the Regia, the ancient house of the kings near the Temple of Vesta, and then to the Temple of Jupiter, and eventually, in defiance of the plan to cremate him in the Campus Martius, burned in the forum itself, the crowd tearing up benches and stalls and anything that would burn to feed the pyre, the flames rising high enough to be seen from the hills. Several of the conspirators' houses were attacked. Brutus and Cassius, reading the situation with the speed that men read situations when the situations have become immediately dangerous, left the city within days. They did not leave precipitously or without political standing. Both were serving as praetors. Both had legitimate authority and legitimate destinations. Brutus eventually reaching Macedonia and Cassius Syria, both provinces from which they could draw military resources, and from which they could wait to see how the political situation in Rome resolved before deciding their next move. Their departure was tactical rather than desperate at first. The weeks that followed made it look increasingly like the latter. Antony's dominance in the immediate aftermath was near total. He held the consulship, Caesar's papers, and the momentum of the forum's response to the funeral. He moved against the conspirators' remaining allies in Rome with the efficiency of a man who understood that political windows close quickly and that the window currently open was the widest he would likely see. Lepidus, who commanded troops outside the city, aligned with Antony, giving the arrangement a military dimension that the Senate's nominal authority could not match. The compromise of the days immediately after the Ides dissolved as the reality of the forum's response made it clear that the amnesty's political premise that Caesar's death would be accepted as a liberation and that his killers could remain in Rome as its heroes had not survived contact with the Roman crowd. Cicero had not been invited into the conspiracy. The conspirators had made this decision deliberately and correctly. Cicero was the greatest orator in Rome, a man of genuine republican conviction, and also a man constitutionally unable to keep a significant secret, whose tendency to discuss his own importance in letters that circulated widely had been a feature of his political career since the Catilinarian crisis. He learned of the assassination after the fact and responded with the complex mixture of relief, alarm, and thwarted energy that characterized his political reactions to events he had not managed to shape. He had approved of the act in principle and was alarmed by its management in practice, and he spent the weeks after the Ides trying to insert himself into a situation that was moving faster than his correspondence could track. His opportunity came in September of 44 BCE, when Antony's dominance began to provoke a Senate reaction, and Cicero delivered the first of what would become 14 speeches against Antony, the Philippics, named with deliberate historical consciousness after Demosthenes' speeches against Philip of Macedon. The comparison positioning Cicero as the defender of republican freedom against a would-be monarch in exactly the tradition that Roman political culture found most resonant. The speeches were brilliant. They were precise in their legal arguments, devastating in their personal attacks, and they positioned Cicero as the Senate's voice at a moment when the Senate needed a voice. They were also, in the way that Cicero's most consequential political interventions tended to be, the foundation of a miscalculation whose full dimensions he would not live to see. He had identified in the young Gaius Octavius, now styling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, a potential instrument. A boy of 18 with a famous name and no military force of his own, or so Cicero assessed the situation, who could be positioned against Antony as a counterweight, used to divide and weaken the Caesarian faction, and then managed once the emergency had passed. The assessment of Octavian as manageable was not unreasonable based on the information available in the autumn of 44 BCE. It became, over the following 18 months, the most consequential misjudgment of Cicero's career, which was a career not short of consequential misjudgments. Brutus and Cassius were building armies in the east. Antony was building his position in Rome and Italy. Octavian was arriving in the city with his great-uncle's name and his great-uncle's will, and a patience that nobody in the room had yet learned to recognize for what it was. The republic that the conspirators had believed they were restoring was not reassembling itself. It was fracturing further, along the lines that Caesar's death had exposed rather than sealed, and the men who would govern its ruins were already in motion, moving toward each other across the Mediterranean world with the accumulated momentum of everything that the previous 15 years had set in motion and left unresolved. Somewhere in Macedonia, Brutus was reading Plato. Somewhere in Syria, Cassius was counting legions. And in Rome, on the Palatine, in a house that still smelled of the smoke of Caesar's pyre, Antony was learning that the young man from Apollonia was not going to be as easy to manage as Cicero had promised. Chapter 12. The Heir Nobody Saw Coming. Octavian was not imposing. This is one of the few physical facts about him that the ancient sources agree on without qualification. He was slight, he was frequently ill, he suffered in cold weather and in heat, he wore extra layers of clothing in mild temperatures, and avoided strong sunlight with a care that his contemporaries found faintly incongruous in a man who would spend the next 60 years directing the affairs of the Roman world. He had a pleasant face, the sources say, and eyes of unusual clarity, and he carried himself with a composure that rid as confidence to some observers and as coldness to others, depending largely on which side of his attention they had found themselves on. He was not physically formidable in the way that Antony was formidable, or Caesar or Pompey before them. He did not project the immediate animal authority of a man whom other men instinctively follow into dangerous places. What he projected, to those who looked carefully enough, was something harder to name and considerably more durable. He had been in Apollonia on the eastern coast of the Adriatic, completing the military and rhetorical education that Roman aristocratic families provided for their promising young men when the news of the assassination reached him. The distance was perhaps 3 days by fast ship in favorable conditions. He crossed in less than that, landing on the Italian coast and making his way carefully, gathering information about the situation in Rome before committing himself to any visible position. The care was characteristic. He was 18 years old and he was already gathering information before moving, which is not what 18-year-olds typically do when they learn that their great uncle has been murdered and has left them his name and his estate. The name was the inheritance that mattered. Caesar's will had adopted him posthumously, a legal mechanism available under Roman law that transferred not merely property but identity, converting Gaius Octavius into Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, a name he began using immediately and completely, understanding with a precision that no one else in Rome seems to have fully registered in those first weeks, that in a city where the name Caesar had acquired the weight it had acquired, the name was worth more than the money. He pressed his claim to the adoption in the Roman courts over the legal objections of those who argued that posthumous adoption was irregular. He distributed the legacies from Caesar's will to the Roman citizens who were owed them, including the 75 denarii that Antony had been slow to release from the estate's funds, borrowing money from Caesar's business associates to make the payments when Antony's control of the estate made direct access difficult. The crowd that received the money noticed who had paid it. Cicero met him that autumn and wrote to Atticus with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has correctly assessed a situation. The young Caesar was, Cicero reported, devoted to him personally, eager for senatorial guidance, entirely amenable to being positioned as the Senate's instrument against Antony, and this was the essential point on which Cicero's entire strategy rested, too young, too inexperienced, and too dependent on senatorial legitimacy to become a danger in himself once Antony had been dealt with. The letter's tone is that of an experienced architect describing a useful piece of material. Cicero had been navigating Roman politics since before Octavian was born, and his reading of the young man was not careless. It was simply wrong in the one dimension that mattered, which was the dimension of patience. The campaign against Antony moved through the winter of 44 and into 43 BCE. Cicero's Philippics gave the Senate's opposition its rhetorical framework. The consuls of 43 BCE, Hirtius and Pansa, led armies north to relieve the town of Mutina, where Antony had besieged Decimus Brutus, and Octavian accompanied them with the forces he had been quietly assembling since his arrival in Italy. The battles at Mutina in April 43 BCE went well enough for the senatorial side. Antony was driven off and Decimus Brutus relieved, but both consuls died in the fighting, Pansa from a wound received in the first engagement, Hirtius in the second. Their deaths were convenient for Octavian in the specific sense that consuls who survive victorious campaigns retain command of their armies and return to Rome with independent authority, while dead consuls leave their armies available to whoever is standing next to them when the situation resolves. Both armies passed, with minimal resistance, under Octavian's command. He marched on Rome. The march was not accompanied by the dramatic crossing of a legal boundary that Caesar's Rubicon crossing had been. Octavian had calculated his position with more precision than that, waiting until the Senate's resistance was sufficiently depleted and his own forces were sufficiently concentrated before making the move that converted his military advantage into a political one. He arrived in Rome in August 43 BCE and demanded the consulship. He was 19 years old. The Senate, which had been maneuvering for months on the assumption that Octavian could be managed, discovered in that August that the maneuverability it had counted on had been consumed while it was busy with Cicero's speeches and the Mutina campaign, and that the young man at the gates with 8 legions was not presenting the Senate with a negotiation, but with a result. The consulship was granted. What came next was the move that completed Cicero's education, though Cicero did not survive long enough to reflect on it at length. Octavian, now consul, entered into negotiations with Antony and Lepidus near Bononia, modern Bologna, in October 43 BCE, and the 3 men spent 2 days on a small island in the river Lavinius, dividing the Roman world among themselves. The second triumvirate that emerged from those 2 days was not the informal private arrangement that Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had assembled in the back rooms of the late Republic. It was a formally constituted legal body, the Tresviri Rei Publicae Constituendae, the 3 men for the organization of the Republic, with powers voted by the Assembly and a defined term of 5 years, which was subsequently extended. It had the constitutional form that the first triumvirate had always lacked, and it used that form to do things that would have shocked the Senate if the Senate had retained the power to be shocked effectively. The proscriptions began within days of the triumvirate's formal establishment. The lists went up in Rome as they had gone up under Sulla 60 years earlier. Names posted, property forfeit, lives available to whoever chose to take them for the price of the reward. Roughly 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians were named in the initial lists, with subsequent additions. The scale was not quite sullen, but the method was identical and the purpose was similar: the elimination of political opposition under the cover of legal process, the transfer of property from the condemned to the condemners, and the demonstration to everyone watching that the new order had both the will and the mechanism to destroy its enemies systematically. Each of the three men contributed names from his own enemy list. Each protected some of his own clients at the cost of concessions to the others. The negotiations over individual names had the character of a transaction, which is what they were. Cicero was on the list. Antony had insisted, and Octavian had conceded the point after what the sources describe as token resistance, the resistance of a man who understood that Cicero's death was the price of Antony's cooperation and who paid it without the visible anguish that would have been dishonest and without the visible indifference that would have been impolitic. Cicero had been warned and had begun moving toward the coast, intending to take ship for Macedonia and Brutus's camp, but he moved slowly, too slowly, in the way of a man who cannot quite believe that the situation has become what it has become, who keeps expecting the political landscape to produce one more room to maneuver in. His litter was stopped on the road near Formia on December 7th, 43 BCE. He put his head out from the curtains and told his slaves to set the litter down, and extended his neck from the litter's side with the composure that he had advocated throughout his philosophical writing, and that he managed at the last moment to actually produce. The centurion Herennius killed him. His head and his hands were cut off and sent to Rome, to Antony, who had them displayed on the rostra from which the Philippics had been delivered, a display whose specific brutality reflected something personal in Antony's response to Cicero that went beyond the normal political violence of the prescriptions. Antony's wife Fulvia, the sources report, and the sources may be embellishing, but the embellishment has been attached to the story since antiquity, took Cicero's severed tongue from the head and drove hairpins through it, a gesture whose symbolic content required no explanation to anyone who had read the Philippics or heard them delivered. The gesture may be an invention. The head on the rostra is attested by multiple sources and was seen by enough people to be beyond reasonable doubt. 63 years old. He had been navigating Roman politics since the year of Sulla's return, since before Caesar had grown his first beard, and he had survived Catiline, and survived Caesar's dictatorship, and survived the chaos of the Ides, and been brought down finally by a miscalculation about an 18-year-old boy who had seemed in the autumn of 44 BCE like someone who could be used and set aside. The miscalculation was understandable. The cost of it was absolute. Brutus and Cassius were still in the east, still building their armies, still holding the eastern provinces and their revenues, and waiting for the moment to move west. The triumvirate was moving east to meet them, carrying the prescription's proceeds and the loyalty of perhaps 40 legions consolidated from the chaos of the previous 2 years. The last engagement of the Republic was assembling itself across the Aegean, in the flat plains of Macedonia, where 2 men who had killed Caesar were waiting for the 3 men who had inherited his name and his wars. The reckoning was perhaps a year away, and autumn was settling over the Mediterranean world with the patient indifference of seasons that continue regardless of what the people moving through them are preparing to do to each other. Chapter 13: The Last War of the Republic. The wars that followed had the quality of exhaustion built into them from the beginning, not the exhaustion of men who had been fighting too long, though that was also true, but the exhaustion of a political situation that had been generating conflict for 30 years and was now consuming its last available fuel. Everyone who would fight at Philippi and at Actium had grown up inside the civil wars. They had been children during Sulla's prescriptions, or adolescents during Caesar's consulship, or young men during the crossing of the Rubicon, and the world in which political disagreement resolved through military force rather than through institutions was not an aberration they were trying to correct, but the only world they had ever fully known. The republic that Brutus and Cassius believed they were fighting to restore existed by 42 BCE, primarily in the speeches they delivered to their troops before battle, in the rhetorical tradition, in the memory of men old enough to remember something that may itself have been, by the time they remembered it, already idealized beyond its actual dimensions. Brutus and Cassius had spent the year following their departure from Rome building their eastern position with a thoroughness that reflected their genuine military and administrative competence. Cassius had secured Syria and its legions, moving with a speed that foreclosed the triumvirate's attempts to replace him with their own appointees. Brutus had Macedonia and the Aegean coast, and between them they controlled a continuous arc of territory from the Adriatic to the Euphrates, with access to the tax revenues of the wealthiest provinces in the Roman world, and the ability to draw on the client kingdoms of the East that had aligned themselves with whoever held Roman authority in the region. Their combined forces at Philippi numbered perhaps 100,000 men, well supplied and fighting on ground of their own choosing, a wide plain near the Aegean coast of Macedonia, flanked by marshes and hills that limited the approaches and constrained the kind of sweeping cavalry maneuver that had decided Pharsalus. Antony and Octavian crossed the Adriatic in the autumn of 42 BCE, with roughly the same number of men and considerably more difficulty reaching them. The crossing itself was contested. Brutus's fleet controlled portions of the Adriatic and intercepted one of Antony's convoys, destroying several thousand soldiers at sea. Octavian was ill during portions of the campaign, his physical fragility surfacing at the worst possible moment, and was not present at full capacity for the first engagement. Antony carried the military weight of the triumvirate side with a competence that this campaign revealed more fully than any previous operation had. He was, in purely military terms, the most capable general of his generation, which was a generation that included men who had learned their trade under Caesar. The first Battle of Philippi was fought in October 42 BCE and produced a result so contradictory that both sides could interpret it as a victory, and both were partially correct. Antony's forces broke Cassius's camp on the triumvirate's right, overrunning it and capturing the standards. Simultaneously, Brutus's forces on the Republican left broke Octavian's camp, driving through it and reaching the point where, had Octavian been present and less protected, the war might have ended differently that afternoon. Cassius, positioned on a hill and unable to see clearly through the battle's dust and smoke, sent a scout to determine the situation on Brutus's side of the field. The scout returned with ambiguous information, or Cassius misread unambiguous information. The sources disagree on which, and Cassius concluded that Brutus's wing had also been broken and that the battle was lost. He ordered his freedman Pindorus to kill him, pulling his cloak over his head in the gesture that had become, in these years, the Roman way of meeting a death one had chosen. He died before learning that Brutus had won his half of the battle. The error was complete and irrecoverable, and it altered everything that followed. Brutus held the field for 3 weeks after the first battle, feeding his troops from the superior supply lines that his control of the eastern provinces provided, waiting for the triumvirate's forces to exhaust themselves against his position. The strategy was sound. His officers were not willing to sustain it. The pressure from within his own command to fight a second pitched battle, the impatience of men who wanted resolution and who read Cassius's death as a reason to act rather than a reason to wait, accumulated until Brutus yielded to it, which was the decision that ended the Republic as a living political project rather than a historical memory. The Second Battle of Philippi, fought 3 weeks after the first, went badly from its opening movements. Brutus's forces advanced with less coordination than the first engagement had shown, the left wing moving before the right was ready, the timing that decides pitched battles in the absence of overwhelming material superiority, failing in the specific way it fails when an army's morale is complicated by the knowledge that its commander had the better strategy and abandoned it. Antony's veterans held and then pressed. The Republican line broke. Brutus left the field with 4 legions still intact and spent the night on a rocky hillside with a small group of companions, the sounds of the pursuit dying away in the dark below him. By the next morning, his remaining commanders had gone over to the triumvirate and the 4 legions with them, and what was left was a man on a hillside with nowhere to go that led to anything he recognized as worth going to. He died by his own hand before dawn, a friend holding the sword. Antony covered his body with a purple cloak, his own, the sources say, and sent the ashes to Brutus's mother Servilia in Rome. Whatever Antony felt about the gesture, it was not inconsistent with the man he had shown himself to be throughout the war, brutal where brutality was necessary and capable, in the specific moments that followed necessary brutality, of something that looked like its opposite. The Roman world divided along the lines that the survivors drew, and the drawing took several years to settle into the configuration that Actium eventually resolved. Antony took the East, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, the client kingdoms and their revenues, and the military resources that the East had always provided more abundantly than the West. Octavian took Italy and the West, which was the harder assignment in immediate terms and the more durable one in the long run, since Italy contained Rome and Rome contained the Senate and the institutions whose nominal authority still organized Roman political life in ways that mattered for legitimacy, even when they no longer mattered for power. Lepidus received Africa and was subsequently maneuvered out of the arrangement by Octavian with a smoothness that reflected how much Octavian had learned in the 3 years since Mutina. Lepidus attempted to use his African legions as leverage in a dispute over Sicily. His troops went over to Octavian without significant resistance, and Lepidus spent the remaining decades of his life under a comfortable house arrest in a coastal town, stripped of everything except the title of Pontifex Maximus, which Octavian declined to take from him because the office was for life, and taking it would have required killing him. And killing Lepidus was not, in 36 BCE, worth the political cost. Sextus Pompey, the younger son of Pompey the Great, who had survived Munda and built a naval force in Sicily that had been disrupting Italian grain supplies for years, was defeated in 36 BCE by Octavian's admiral Agrippa at the naval battle of Naulochus, and subsequently captured and killed in Asia Minor. With Sextus gone and Lepidus neutralized, Octavian controlled the western Mediterranean completely, and the question that had been building since Philippi, whether the division of the Roman world between two men was a stable arrangement or simply the final pause before the last civil war, began to answer itself. Antony's years in the East produced the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, the ceremony in which he distributed eastern territories among his children with Cleopatra, territories that were Roman or Roman adjacent or Roman claimed, in a public ceremony that dressed itself in Egyptian royal tradition and read from Rome across the Mediterranean as the founding of a rival monarchy. Caesarion was proclaimed the legitimate son of Julius Caesar and the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy, a claim that directly contradicted Octavian's own position as Caesar's adopted son and heir. Alexander Helios received Armenia and Media and the Parthian territories that Antony had not actually conquered. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica. Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. The children were dressed in the costumes of their kingdoms and displayed to the Alexandrian crowd with the theatrical confidence of a man who had decided that the political break with Rome was already irrecoverable and that he might as well make it legible. Octavian made it legible in Rome instead, reading from Antony's will, obtained from the Vestal virgins who held it, under circumstances that even his supporters acknowledged were legally irregular, passages that described Antony's wishes to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, and framing the entire Eastern arrangement as evidence that Antony had been captured, in the most essential sense, by a foreign queen who intended to move Rome's center of power to Egypt. The framing was partially accurate and completely strategic. It allowed Octavian to declare war on Cleopatra rather than on Antony, which was a distinction that mattered enormously for the narrative. A war against a foreign queen threatening Rome was a righteous defense of the Republic's dignity. A war against Antony was simply the last civil war, which Rome was too exhausted to face honestly. Actium was fought on September 2nd, 31 BCE, at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf on the western coast of Greece, where Antony's fleet had been blockaded for months by Agrippa's superior naval management. The battle that followed was not quite what either side had planned. Antony's intention seems to have been a fighting withdrawal, to break through the blockade with enough forces to reach Egypt and regroup, rather than the decisive engagement that a straightforward reading of the battle's geography would suggest. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships held the center rear of the formation. When a gap opened in the fighting around midday, her ships moved through it, their sails raised, the sails being the detail that the sources emphasize, since warships in battle did not carry sails, and raising them meant one thing, which was departure rather than maneuver. Whether what followed was planned between her and Antony in advance, or whether Antony's decision to follow her was made in the moment, is a question the ancient sources answer differently and that cannot be resolved from the evidence available. Antony transferred to a smaller ship and followed Cleopatra's squadron south, away from the battle, leaving his fleet and his legions to continue fighting without him. His fleet fought on for several hours before surrendering. His legions, encamped on shore and now without a commander or a strategic purpose, negotiated their surrender to Octavian over the following week. Antony reached Cleopatra's flagship, the sources report, and sat alone at the prow for 3 days without speaking to her, staring at the water. Whatever passed between them in those 3 days is not recorded, and the silence itself seems right. There was nothing to say about what had happened at Actium that the act of following her through the gap had not already said completely. They reached Alexandria. Octavian followed at the pace of a man who has won and knows it, and feels no need to hurry the conclusion. Antony's remaining forces in Egypt dissolved or defected as Octavian's army advanced. In August of 30 BCE, Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had died. She had sealed herself in her mausoleum, and the message that reached him was garbled or deliberately falsified. The sources disagree, and he fell on his sword with the completeness of a man who had decided that the thing he was falling on his sword for was already gone. He was carried to the mausoleum still living, was hauled up through a window by ropes because Cleopatra would not open the doors, and died in her arms, asking for wine and telling her, according to Plutarch, that she should not grieve but count him fortunate for the life he had lived. Cleopatra survived him by 11 days. She met with Octavian, who received her with the formal courtesy of a man who intended to display her in his triumph and was making the necessary arrangements. She was 39 years old and had governed Egypt for 21 years and had understood every Roman she had ever dealt with a clarity that the Romans themselves did not always manage. She understood Octavian. She died on August 12th, 30 BCE, in her mausoleum by a method that the ancient sources place as a snakebite from an asp, the royal cobra, the uraeus, the symbol of Egyptian sovereignty, though Plutarch notes that no snake was found and that other methods were possible. The detail of the snake has attached itself to her death with the permanence of things that are symbolically inevitable, regardless of their literal accuracy. She had arranged it so that Octavian could not display her, and she had arranged it with the precision that had characterized every significant decision of her adult life. Caesarion was 17. Octavian had him found and killed within days, efficiently and without ceremony, on the grounds that too many Caesars were a structural problem that the new order could not accommodate. With him died the last living connection to Julius Caesar by blood, and with that death the chapter that had opened in 100 BCE on a Roman street where a child was born into a patrician family of distinguished lineage and modest means reached its final entry. Octavian stood in Alexandria in the late summer of 30 BCE and looked at a world that had no more civil wars left to generate, not because the causes of civil war had been resolved, but because the men who might have fought them were dead, and the institutions that had structured the competition among them had been emptied of the independent authority that made competition worth fighting for. What remained was one man, 40 legions, the entire Mediterranean basin, and the question of what to call what had happened and what to build in the space that the last 30 years had cleared. He sailed west toward Rome, and the long quiet that nobody had quite dared to name was beginning. Chapter 14. The Long Quiet. The world that received Octavian's return in 29 BCE was not the world that had sent Caesar north to Gaul 30 years earlier, and the difference was not merely political. It was demographic, economic, architectural, psychological. The accumulated consequence of a generation of civil war running through every dimension of Roman life simultaneously. The Italian countryside showed it in the villages that had not recovered their populations, in the farmland that had changed hands so many times through confiscation and resettlement that the boundaries of ownership had become a matter of dispute rather than record, in the veteran colonies planted on land that had belonged to someone else before the legions needed it. The senatorial class showed it in the gaps, families that had been continuous for centuries, ending in a single year's proscription list. The old patrician networks thinned to the point where the Senate that met in 29 BCE contained men whose grandfathers would not have recognized its membership as legitimately Roman. The provinces showed it in the tax arrears and the disrupted trade routes and the client kingdoms that had changed allegiances so many times in the previous 15 years that their rulers had developed a diplomatic flexibility that bordered on the philosophical. Three triumphs ran through Rome in August of 29 BCE across 3 consecutive days over Illyricum, over Actium, over Egypt, and the city received them with the relief of people who have been told that something is finally finished and are prepared to believe it even before they are entirely certain. The spoils from Egypt were substantial enough that the interest rate in Rome dropped measurably in the months following the triumph, as Ptolemaic gold entered the Roman financial system at a volume that adjusted the price of credit across the Italian peninsula. The doors of the Temple of Janus were closed. The temple stood in the forum and had 2 sets of doors facing opposite directions, and Roman tradition held that the doors stood open in time of war, open so that Janus, the god of beginnings and transitions, could move freely to where he was needed, and were closed only when Rome was at peace with the entire world. They had been closed twice in the entire history of the Republic, both times briefly, both times controversially. They were closed now, and this time they stayed closed, and the city understood what the gesture meant before any speech was made about it. Octavian spent the years between 29 and 27 BCE managing the transition with the patience and precision that had characterized everything he had done since stepping off the boat from Apollonia 15 years earlier. The legions needed to be reduced from the 60 or so that the civil wars had accumulated to a standing force that the empire's revenues could sustain, and that did not represent, simply by existing, a permanent invitation to the next ambitious general to make the calculation that Caesar had made at the Rubicon. He settled on 28 legions, roughly 150,000 soldiers, distributed across the frontier provinces, and commanded by men whose loyalty was to him rather than to any independent military tradition. The veterans of the discharged legions received land grants and cash settlements on a scale that the Republic had never managed, drawing on the Egyptian treasury and the confiscated estates of the defeated faction to honor obligations that Caesar and Antony and every general before them had also promised and consistently deferred. The constitutional settlement of January 27 BCE was conducted with the theatrical care of a man who had been studying political performance since childhood and who understood that the manner of a thing in Rome was inseparable from the thing itself. Octavian appeared before the Senate and delivered a speech in which he offered to return his extraordinary powers. his accumulated military commands, his control of the key provinces, his authority over the legions, to the Senate and the Roman people, from whom he said he had received them in the emergency of the civil wars, and to whom they properly belonged now that the emergency had passed. The Senate, which contained men he had appointed, and men who depended on his favor, and men who had simply been watching Roman politics long enough to know a performance when they saw one, and to understand that the correct response to this particular performance was the one he was waiting for, asked him to keep the powers. He accepted, with expressions of reluctance that the sources record without visible irony. What was distributed in the settlement's technical provisions was genuinely intricate. He retained proconsular imperium, the authority to command armies, over the provinces that contained legions, which was to say over all the provinces that mattered militarily, while the Senate retained nominal governance of the peaceful interior provinces through its own appointed governors. He held tribunician power, the ancient inviolable authority of the people's tribune, which gave him the legal standing of a representative of the Roman people and the personal protection of sacrosanctity, renewed annually by the Senate for the remaining 41 years of his life, so that each year's renewal was simultaneously a constitutional formality and a demonstration of where power actually resided. He accepted the title princeps, first citizen, first among equals, which had a republican pedigree reaching back to Scipio Africanus and carried none of the monarchical connotation that rex or dominus would have carried. He refused the title dictator, which Caesar had accepted and which had become, in the Roman political vocabulary, the word that meant the thing had gone too far. He refused the title rex, which no Roman of any political tendency was prepared to accept regardless of what the reality behind the title was. The name the Senate gave him in that January session was Augustus, from the Latin augere, to increase, to consecrate, to make holy, a word that carried religious weight without making a specific theological claim, that suggested elevation above the ordinary without the precise political content of a formal title, that could mean the consecrated one or the revered one, or simply the one whom the gods had distinguished, and that meant all of these things simultaneously in the way that Rome's most durable political language always operated, carrying its ambiguities as features rather than flaws. He was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus from that January onward, and the name Caesar, which had been a family name 2 generations earlier and a political inheritance 1 generation earlier, was now becoming something else, a title, a category, a word that would travel through the languages of the next 2 millennia and arrive in German as Kaiser and in Russian as Tsar and in the Persian tradition as Shah. The consonants shifted by time and distance, but the thing itself still recognizable, still pointing back to a child born in Rome in 100 BCE, into a patrician family of distinguished lineage and modest means. The month Sextilis was renamed Augustus in his honor by the Senate's decree in 8 BCE, a quieter gesture than the triumphs, the kind of permanent inscription that outlasts the monuments built specifically to last. July had already been named for Caesar. The 2 men now occupied consecutive months of every year in every calendar that descended from the one Sosigenes had calculated in 46 BCE, which is to say every calendar in the Western world for the next 15 centuries, and most of the calendars that followed the Gregorian correction after that. The institutions of the Republic continued. Consuls were elected each year, their names recorded in the official fasti, as they had been recorded for nearly 5 centuries. The Senate met, debated, passed decrees, appointed governors to the peaceful provinces, heard embassies from foreign kingdoms, maintained the forms of deliberative government with a thoroughness that was itself a political achievement. It was easier to accept a change that looked like continuity than one that announced itself as rupture, and Augustus had learned this from Caesar's mistakes as clearly as he had learned anything. Magistrates ascended the cursus honorum. Law courts heard cases under laws that had been on the books for generations. The machinery moved, and it moved in the familiar grooves, and the fact that its output was now determined by a single man's preferences rather than by the competition among senatorial factions was a fact that everyone knew and almost no one said aloud in public, because saying it aloud required deciding what it meant, and deciding what it meant required confronting the gap between the form and the substance that Augustus had made it everyone's interest to leave unexamined. He ruled for 41 years after Actium. The Pax Augusta, the Augustan peace, settled over the Mediterranean world with the particular quality of a long exhale, the collective relief of a civilization that had been generating civil wars for a century and had finally consumed the material necessary to sustain them. The frontiers held, more or less. The grain supply moved, more or less. The provinces were administered with a consistency that the Republic's annual magistrate system had never quite achieved. Roads were built, aqueducts were extended. The city of Rome itself was remade in marble, where Caesar had begun it in brick. The temples and the forums and the public buildings accumulating into something that looked, from the outside, like the physical expression of permanent order. Virgil wrote the Aeneid in these years, the great poem of Rome's founding that traced the city's origins to Aeneas, and through Aeneas to Venus, and through Venus to the Julian line, ending with the peace that Augustus represented as the fulfillment of a divine plan set in motion at Troy. The poem was genuinely great. It was not propaganda in the sense of being false, but it was also not innocent of the political moment in which it was written, and Virgil was honest enough, or the poem was complex enough, that the cost of the piece is legible in it alongside the piece itself. Aeneas carries his father from burning Troy and abandons Dido in Carthage and founds a city in the wrong place for the right reasons, and the sorrow that runs through the poem's most famous lines, Sunt lacrimae rerum, there are tears in things, is not the sorrow of a civilization that has lost its way, but of one that has found its way at considerable cost and is honest enough to count the cost even while celebrating the destination. The tears in things. The Republic's defenders had been right that something was being lost, and they had been unable to prevent the losing, and what replaced it was not what they had feared and not what they had hoped, and was, in the way of most historical outcomes, simply what it was, durable in ways that surprised everyone, and fragile in ways that would not become visible for another 2 centuries. Caesar had been dead for 14 years when Augustus received his name from the Senate, and the world that January's settlement organized bore his imprint so completely that the imprint had become invisible. The calendar, the legions, the colonial settlements, the enlarged Senate, the precedent of personal military authority superseding institutional constraint, the name itself. Augustus had studied Caesar's failures as carefully as his successes, and had corrected them with the patience of a man who had time, and the corrections were good enough to last. The monarchy that Rome had expelled in 509 BCE and refused ever since to name by its proper name had returned in a form sufficiently unlike its predecessors that the refusal could be maintained, and was maintained for 3 centuries. Outside the city, through the long winters and the long summers of the Augustan peace, the olive trees that had been growing in the Italian hills since before the Republic was founded continued their slow accumulation of rings. The Tiber ran its brown course to the sea. The farmers in the Po Valley planted in spring and harvested in autumn as they had planted and harvested through the Gratian crisis and the social war and the Sullan prescriptions and the rise of Caesar and the years of the civil wars. The agricultural calendar proceeding with the indifference to political events that only the agricultural calendar sustains. The legions on the Rhine and the Danube and the Euphrates maintained their watch through the cold months, the fires in their camps visible for miles across the flat frontier land, the soldiers inside them doing what soldiers in camps do through the long nights of garrison duty, which is mostly waiting for something that mostly does not come. The world settled. The long war was over, and what remained of the Republic lived in its forms and its language, and the memory of men who were growing old enough that their grandchildren would know it only as history, as the thing that had existed before, the arrangement that the civil wars had ended, the system whose defenders had died at Philippi and at Utica and on a road near Formiae with their necks extended toward a blade. It lived in Cicero's speeches, copied and recopied in the scriptoria of the Italian towns, studied by the young men who were learning Latin rhetoric in a world that had made rhetoric simultaneously more ornamental and less dangerous than it had been when Cicero was alive to practice it. It lived in Caesar's commentary, clear and compressed and written in the third person, the prose still moving through the Gallic countryside with the unhurried confidence of a narrative that knows exactly where it is going. The doors of the temple of Janus remained closed. The seasons continued. The olive trees grew another ring and then another, and the long quiet deepened into something that was not quite peace and not quite not peace, but that was for the people living inside it, close enough to rest that they accepted it and were grateful and did not ask too many questions about what it was they were resting in. The chronicle has reached its end. Rest well.